Hi, I'm Allie, and I'm a North America keeper here at the Oregon Zoo. Safety is our #1 priority, not only for our guests, but our staff members who work very closely with these animals, and of course for the beloved animals. I'm in the beaver habitat at the zoo, and you're at the Metro Regional Center. The council chambers are located on the 3rd floor. In the event of a fire or fire alarm, please exit through the door in the northeast corner of the room, go down the stairway to the 2nd floor, exit through the main entrance by the reception desk, and gather in the courtyard outside the entrance. In the event of a medical or fire emergency, please call 911 and notify the agent at the reception desk. The nearest defibrillator is mounted on the steps leading from the reception desk down to Grand Avenue. Thank you, and please come visit us here at the Oregon Zoo.
Today, about the meeting of the Day of Awareness, we have Katie McDonald, Tribal Affairs Liaison, and
I'll help introduce.
okay, thank you.
Yeah. Good morning. Cheschalhat, Kelly Mali, Louis Gwext, Janice Elkaiken, Ukalis Base, Kelly Hu, Janice Lemty Elwasket. Good morning, Council. My name is Katie McDonald. I shared with you my tribal affiliation and that I'm thankful to be here today. We're here to present and share information on the Day of Awareness for Missing or Murdered Indigenous People. As you might recall, our proclamation proclaiming every May 5th as Missing and Murdered Indigenous Peoples Day was something that we discussed in our council meeting last year and brought forward. We're able to share that proclamation with you or any other interested parties after this meeting if folks want to request that. We've been working as Tribal Affairs to bring these important days of awareness and months of awareness forward to council for a conversation with you all and to increase opportunities for education and deepening our understanding of our staff and the public who engage in these spaces. And I think something we've been trying to bring forward in all of these conversations is not if these days of awareness have an intersection with the work that we do, but what are all the ways that these days of awareness and important topics and priorities intersect with the work? So the question shouldn't be, does it intersect, but how much time are we going to take to really introspect and look at the issue and find the multitude of ways that it's connected to our work and how we can support and be responsive to what tribes and urban Indigenous community members are asking for us as a regional government. Tribal Affairs is usually here presenting on these days of awareness, and I'm really excited this year that we actually have several members of our Indigenous Employee Affinity Group here. These folks do a lot of the heavy lifting and the work behind the scenes, and I often get to be the face, but I want you all to get to start meeting these folks and interacting with them as we have these conversations. So I'll go ahead and hand things over to Michael, who will kick us off, and both of our staff will introduce themselves throughout the presentation.
Thank you, Katie. Trigger warning. This presentation contains mentions of violence and death that may be sensitive or triggering for folks tuning in or in the audience. We encourage those listening to take the space and resources they need during our presentation. My name is Michael Lee. I use they, them pronouns. I am Native American, German, and Norwegian. To showcase my intersectionality, I work as the Equity Program Manager in the Waste Prevention and Environmental Services Department at Metro. I am also one of the current co-chairs of the Pride, or the LGBTQIA+ Employee Resource Group, and a member of the People of Color Employee Resource Group.
Good morning. I hope you all are well today. My name is Felicia Tiba. My pronouns are she, they. I'm an enrolled member of the Pueblo of Acoma in New Mexico, as well as a descendant of the Pueblos of Santa Clara and Jemez and the Navajo Nation, all located in New Mexico. I am an education technician on the Community Education and Stewardship team in Parks and Nature. I'm also a member of the planning team for the POC Employee Resource Group. Thank you for giving us this time. For me, this is a very important issue because I can remember the first time that I knew of someone in my community who became a unfortunately murdered Indigenous woman when I was in the 6th grade. And then further, when I was in middle school, a young woman who attended my school, she went missing as well. And unfortunately, when they found her, she was no longer in this world. So it is with those people in mind that we present this to all of you.
MMIP, or Missing or Murdered Indigenous People, is an acronym that the movement uses to represent thousands of unique American Indians, Native Americans, and Indigenous persons who have gone missing or have been murdered. They are individuals with family and friends. They have their own unique, complex context and background. These families and individuals have experiences of trauma and tragedy. Each of these people have a history and a future that either was erased or is forever changed. It is important for us to honor each as individuals and to seek justice for those who have been taken and reunification for those who are lost. We know that violence affects all communities and that it disproportionately impacts BIPOC, queer communities in the United States. By focusing on one of the most significant impacted communities, we hope to uplift all communities impacted by violence. In 2016, it was reported by the National Crime Information Center that there were 5,712 reports of missing American Indian and Alaska Native women and girls. And the US Department of Justice Federal Missing Persons Database only logged 116 cases. The earrings I'm wearing today are representation of that number. Each red bead represents 5 individuals missing or murdered in 2016. And if you are on Zoom, you may not be able to see each bead, but you can see how long they are. Red is the official color of the movement, so you may see people wearing red in support. Despite the first declaration of Missing or Murdered Indigenous People Day on May 5th, 2017 nationally, Native women and relatives continue to go missing and are murdered at an alarming rate. One of the issues we advocate for later in the presentation is addressing that we have no updated or current data on reports. This all reflects the intersection of genocide, colonialization, and violence against women and relatives, including but not limited to domestic violence, sexual assault, forced sterilization, and trafficking. These crimes occur due to a long history of government laws, policies, practices, and programs that continue to this day and create conditions that increase Indigenous peoples' vulnerability.
In response, Native families and Indigenous communities across Alaska, the lower 48 states, and Hawaii are calling for justice and reforms to dismantle the systematic barriers impacting the safety of Native relatives and to increase support for protections as defined by Indigenous voices, languages, and teachings. These Indigenous calls against such violence date as far back as first contact with Western governments and are reflected in Indigenous acts of resistance and self-defense throughout history. Turning grief into action, tribes, tribal community members, and tribal organizations are calling upon federal, state, tribal, local, and international policymakers to address the foundational reforms required to address MMIP beyond individual cases. The crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous people must continue to be brought into the public's awareness to increase the accountability of social, health, educational, military, religious, political, economic, and government systems and responses. It is essential on the broadest level to acknowledge the historic and ongoing human suffering and death that colonization has brought to Indigenous women and communities, here in what we now know as the United States and globally. Systemic changes are needed across all systems and sectors of society, including the public, governmental, private, business, corporations, nonprofit, educational, military, religious, healthcare, and mainstream media sectors. Policymakers at the federal, tribal, state, and local levels need to know that enough is enough. What is the data in Oregon? Recent survey by our Indigenous staff of MMIP cases in Oregon. 33 American Indian or Alaskan Native persons listed as missing in the Oregon State Police database, unfortunately, including recent cases. In a Google search for information about these missing persons, information for many of the cases was very limited or non-existent. Anecdotally, one of our Indigenous staff shared seeing an additional 3 cases of missing Indigenous community members in the last month, who were identified as missing in the greater Portland area that were shared on social media, but did not appear in the OSP database. And we can see a real-time issue with data, reporting by law enforcement agencies and news outlets, and tracking the status of missing persons.
So what are we doing as Metro to observe this? On May 5th, we have red lighting at the Oregon Convention Center. Strong Hearts Native Hotline is a 24/7 confidential and anonymous cultural, appropriate domestic and sexual violence helpline for Native Americans. Their signage will be at the venues. And we have an installation at the Metro Regional Center that will have information to share with staff and guests that is open now from April 29th to May 17th. This installation will include items to honor and remember missing community members and educational resources for staff and guests to learn more. We'll also be sharing information in Metro Regional Center about 3 bills that are the focus of the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center advocacy programming for MMIP Week 2024. Metro GAPD, or Government Affairs Policy Development, is available to provide a briefing on these bills after today's staff presentation. Those 3 bills are the Tribal Law Enforcement Act, Senate 2695, House Representative 4524, the Bridging Agency Data Gaps Badges for Native Communities Act, Senate 465, House Representative 1292, and the Family Violence Prevention and Services Improvement Act of 2023, House Representative 2604 and Senate 2693. We're happy to connect you to GAPD for more information on these bills. A few Metro staff will be having a coffee hour on May 7th with community guests at Metro Regional Center to talk and discuss about MMIP. We have also collaborated with community programming and sponsored Future Generations. Others in Portland are also working on this. The City of Portland and Multnomah County will both have proclamations in the coming week. Community partners and advocates are also leading programming at Barbie's Village later this week and exploring opportunities to post MMIP and educational posters around Portland.
Our specific requests for support for council. The community and culturally specific programming we do that is connecting with Indigenous community members and communities alike, such as the Community Education and Stewardship Team, has the ability to act as a preventative factor for Native communities in the MMIP crisis. Our culturally specific programming can also help with healing after victimization for individuals, families, and communities. Metro has just kicked off budget season. We ask counselors to uplift areas and requests for culturally specific programming across the agency's recently proposed budget. Here are additional ways those listening to the council presentation this morning can support. Learn more about local and national organizations addressing MMIP issues. Advocate for increased and sustained funding for culturally specific programming and services to support American Indian and Alaskan Native tribes and communities. Advocate for improved data collection, reporting, and coordination practices for local, state, federal, and tribal law enforcement organizations to increase quality, access, and timelines of information and data on missing American Indian and Alaskan Native persons. Advocate with your elected officials. We will be sharing information in the Metro Regional Center about 3 bills that are the focus of the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center Advocacy Program for MMIP Week 2024. GAPD is happy to schedule briefings with interested counselors about these bills to learn more. In closing, violence against Indigenous people is preventable.
And we are asking all those concerned for the safety of Native people to organize at the local, tribal, state, national, and international levels to support and address this epidemic.
We thank you for your time this morning in council to share a united call to action and to help grow the awareness, understanding, and desire of our Metro community to hold ourselves and all systems and sectors of our governments and societies accountable to Native people, the injustices they face, and the healing they deserve.
Thank you, Michael and Felicia, for that presentation and everything that you shared with us. And I just want to thank, we have some of our government, City of Portland partners and community partners here in the council meeting with us today and online. I want to thank them for joining us, and to the rest of our staff who are part of our Indigenous Employee Affinity Group who put a lot of time and effort into all of the programming that was just shared. Really want to thank those folks, elevate their contributions to this work. And we wouldn't be able to do this without all of the amazing project management and logistical coordination of Ashley Schofield in our Government Affairs and Policy Development Office. So thanks, Ashley. And we'd like to return the mic back to you, Councillor Wong, and the rest of council for discussion and any questions you might have.
Great, thank you so much. Colleagues, any comments, questions? Well, I just want to thank you all, Michael, Felicia, Katie. Thanks for sharing your data, stories, and avenues for advocacy. And I was actually wondering, you had mentioned budgeting opportunities for culturally specific programs and interventions. Do you know where those might lie specifically across the agency?
I'll start a response to that program and hand it to Felicia, and then Michael, welcome you to chime in as well. One of the programs in our agency in the Parks and Nature Department that we've shared with you about before in the past is actually our Community Education and Stewardship team, who is a team within the Parks and Nature Department that is out at our natural area sites leading programming with community. And that's all of the public and our broader community, but also they respond to specific requests from tribal serving organizations, urban Indigenous community members, and also our tribal partners when they're asking to get connected with our sites to be able to engage in traditional and cultural practices that are connected to the land. So that is a place, for instance, in the budget where you might see requests coming forward to council through Parks and Nature for some of that work. And actually, Felicia, I'm not sure if you're a part of that team. You might want to offer some reflections on that work.
Yes, so the Community Education and Stewardship team in Parks and Nature does a lot of work with both the Indigenous community and the broader community. We believe as a team that getting connection, building relationships to the land that Metro manages is a critical thing, because connection to the land is important for all of us, whether we are Indigenous or not, whether we come from the Indigenous communities of this region or from other regions. Being connected to these places is important for our spiritual safety, for building community with each other, for building relationships with each other. And those things can factor into a person's safety and a person's coming back into the community when they experience traumatic incidences such as what we are talking about here today.
Michael, I don't know if there's any other in the PES program.
Well, I would just add that I know that the agency is working towards getting tribal affairs in all of the departments, and that's a priority for me specifically. I can't speak on regards to anybody else, but that's really important. And then we do a lot of equity literacy within my department as well, in my role.
Mm-hmm. And we do have an increased budget request for the Tribal Affairs Program in GAP-D this year before council to increase resources to actually help support culturally specific programming and relationship building with the Oregon Zoo. So it is nested throughout the budget in different places, and we appreciate you all keeping an eye out for that and helping us uphold and uplift those requests for funding.
Thank you. And Andrew, are those in the budgets that we're seeing now already, or are they specific requests for additional amendments?
Yeah, it's a little bit of a combination, specifically on the last one, the GAP-D request. We touched on that very briefly during the COO office budget presentation last week. And then some of the other programs are ongoing programs, but we can follow back up with Katie and sort of make sure it's really clear with council where those programs lie. Councilor Lewis.
Sure. Thank you so much. I want to thank you for being here on such a heavy and hard subject that has touched the community and individuals in this room. So I want to proceed with honoring folks who are able to come and those that are more silent because it is so personal and sensitive. But the opportunity to be here in this space, obviously with our tribal relations and that formal relationship that we have with tribes being different than the relationship that we as an agency are developing with urban Indigenous and directly with people and community. So I'm delighted to hear about the investments that we've made in creating space and time for our employees to come together. I hope that we model that for other agencies in the region, and glad to have other colleagues from some of our partners, notably absent would be constituents of mine in Clackamas County, and I hope that they can rise to the occasion in future years. My hope is that we are able to help at the federal level, calling out very specifically the agenda of the coalition today, I think is one way. We spend resource and time on DC, and having those bills, not necessarily their numbers, but some of their names, I think on top of mind for us as we go to DC, as we talk with our federal representatives. I'm appreciative of and want to do more. So Katie and team, I look forward to those conversations. Thank you.
Counselor Nolan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for being with us and sharing your stories and your pain. It's important that we set aside time to remember where there has been cruelty, where there has been suffering, and to learn from that. And I appreciate the forward thinking, the forward movement, I would say, that Metro has taken on these issues, particularly around commemorating joyful and fabulous contributions that the Indigenous peoples in this area have made to our culture and our lives today. I'm hoping that you will continue to challenge us to do more until we get to a day when we are truly just remembering murdered and missing people, and we are not counting the ones who have been added to that group in the last year.
Thank you. Counselor Rosenthal.
Thank you, Chair Huang. Like Councilors Lewis and Nolan, I want to appreciate the fact that you're here today, and thank you for your testimony and your sharing. I do have one question, and since the Indigenous peoples occupied the entire of the Americas, and I believe that this problem is persistent in both north of the border as well as south of the border. I'm just curious, do Canada and Mexico have similar remembrances? And is there any international coordination going on to deal with this across these borders?
I am not sure about Mexico, but I do know in Canada that this issue is incredibly serious. Just north of us in British Columbia, if people are interested in learning more about that, the Highway of Tears is a very serious issue where many Indigenous women, Indigenous people have gone missing along a section of Canadian highway in British Columbia. I do know that they acknowledge that there. Like I said, I'm not entirely sure about, the entirety of the world in recognizing this issue.
I would just add to that, in the United Nations Declaration of Rights for Indigenous People, there is some discussion about the rights and the humanity that needs to be acknowledged and afforded to Indigenous people all over the globe, and acknowledgement that colonization is an ongoing process that affects Indigenous communities everywhere, that can unfortunately result in the disappearance, loss, and violence against those communities. To make another connection to other conversations we've been having in this space, we've previously talked about and started to bring forward the history of boarding schools and other institutions that were government and church sanctioned and funded. And you can think about those as government and church sanctioned processes to disappear people. And so related, there are conversations between First Nations communities in Alaska, folks in the United States, and actually conversations in Mexico where boarding school or church-related institutions were actually established and operating even in the 1600s there. So a lot of these things are connected to each other. But sorry, we don't have a more fuller response to your question, Counselor.
Thank you.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for doing this every year. You know, I think last year was my first experience, and the magnitude took some time for it to really settle in. But this is, you know, something that I think about a lot year round now. And hopefully we as Metro will continue to do that as well. And please reach out anytime. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, next up, we will hear a budget presentation from our visitor venues. And I'm gonna appreciate all the community members for coming out today. And we'll have Metro's General Manager of Visitor Venues, Steve Falstick, here to begin the presentation and introduce additional staff.
There's strength in numbers, directors, come on up. Well, thank you, Deputy President Long and councilors. We're thrilled to be here today. This year's a little bit different. We're doing all the venues in one session. And we've got a short amount of time to do that. There's never enough time. We could be here 6 hours and still not get into the depth of the venues. But I want to thank and acknowledge, first of all, our directors and their teams in this 1 hour will represent thousands of hours that they've put into a successful budget and more importantly, a plan to execute that budget in fiscal 25. And for the record, I'm Steve Falstick, General Manager of Visitor Venues. I use he, him pronouns. The goal in venues is to deliver excellence. And what that looks like is through jobs, through economic impact, and through community benefit. And what you'll hear today, you'll see a lot of numbers, but you also hear a story on how our venues and directors intend to do that. There are opportunities and challenges that are similar for all venues, and there's challenges that are unique opportunities as well. We know, especially in Portland, that businesses are struggling with inflation, rising costs all across the board, and influences that we've struggled with from a visitation standpoint, which is a key indicator for the convention center, but also for the other venues. We look at 2019 as the benchmark of where we want to get back to. Visitation in 2023 compared to 2019 was at 80%. So we're 80% of where we were in 2019. And there's efforts continue to be in place. I think baby steps is what's happening with that, but the signs continue to be good. One of the largest issues for Portland and for our venues has been safety and security. And I think you'll hear some very proactive steps that have been taken to further improve that and just continue to make progress towards a full recovery for our city. With that, I'm going to hand off to directors, and we're going to start with P5 and Robin Williams.
Okay, thank you, councilors. Next slide, please. My presentation basically follows an outline that was requested by you all. So we'll jump right into it. Next slide, please. So Portland 5's investment was our budget modifications request in FY24. Of those, one of the requests was for additional security that, address a major concern that was noted in a security assessment to ensure that our security agents patrol in pairs, and that's in place and working very well. Our other expanded budget modification was, for the first time, P5 requested real funding for our DEI work. And I'm incredibly proud of the work that we laid out this year. You'll see it continue in the next fiscal year. We've spent a lot of time focusing on internal assessments and training. We created a community advisory council who guides us in seeking ways that we can showcase marginalized performers in our community on our stages, as well as working with our youth. We have no budget modifications requested in the FY25 budget. Next slide, please. And I'm going to turn this over to our finance manager, Ashley Sloan.
Thank you, Robin. Thank you, counselors. My name is Ashley Sloan. I'm the finance manager for Merck, and I will be doing the budget overviews for all of the venues. So let's kick it off with P5. Resource-wise, they're going to have a good year in FY25. They have 15% increase year over year, which is 3.3 million. That's mostly being driven by charges for services. They have 2 extra weeks of Broadway and a stellar lineup of shows. Along with resources going up, expenses go up as well. Total of 26.5 million in expenses, which is 12% increase year over year. That is being driven by personnel, is 12% of year over year increase. That is not any change to FTE though. So that is 72 this year, 72 next year. So that is just the increase of the market being paid more. So that's driving that increase. Materials and services are up 13%. P5 is not any different than the other venues. They are very much affected by rising cost of living, inflation, and utilities are going up. So driving your expenses up for every venue. Because the resources are at 24.7 million and the expenses are 26.5, that means that we are budgeting for a $1.7 million operating deficit. Next slide, please. Capital projects for P5 are very important. We've got the Schnitzer roof, which is budgeted 4 to 7 million. And the total project that we've budgeted right now is 5 million. So we need to keep track of those projects. And because we are in a deficit position, we are paying that from the fund balance. Currently, we are projecting a $1.8 million ending fund balance in the budget. And again, with the FTE, we have 72 permanent or 71.95 permanent full-time, no increase year over year. I'll hand it back to you, Robin.
All right, next slide, please. These are the programs that have informed the FY25 budget for P5. First of all, we have a very strong Broadway season in commercial business. It's pegged to be one of our best business years ever. Some of our classical resident company attendance continues to remain soft. Our Portland 5 presentations are focusing more on big popular shows that actually help us drop some money to the bottom line. Our materials and services reflect end of life catch up. For example, we're having to replace 49 computers. That are reaching the end of their life. Our DEI and community work has a slight increase. We still feel that we need to continue to invest in this work, even in spite of a really rough budget. This work is too important to let up on. One of our biggest challenges, our Metro support costs are up. Our personnel costs are up quite a bit, largely due to pay equity, and that's causing the negative impact to the budget. Plus, capital continues to burn down our fund balance. And so we're ending the year, as Ashley has said, with a deficit of 1.7 million in spite of a really good business year. This is something we're going to have to really focus on between now and the beginning of next fiscal year, because we're going to need a solution to this, because we're not able to sustain this. We will be out of fund balance in a very short time. So we've got to look at either more subsidy dollars to P5 or rate increases. So we look forward to having some conversations on that as we move forward. Next slide, please. This shows you a bit of our funding sources. We are 83% earned revenue. So we basically have to make up the money that we use to subsidize our nonprofit users and to help take care of the buildings. Next slide, please. Our performance measures for this next fiscal year, we are budgeted for 100 commercial shows, 88 Broadway shows, and we're targeting a year-end total attendance of 600,000 or greater. If we fail to meet any of these, we'll have a negative impact to our budget. We believe these are achievable goals. Next slide, please. We believe our equity work is highly impactful because we focus exclusively on BIPOC and LGBTQ plus communities, as well as youth that are negatively impacted by home instability, incarceration or deportation, and people with disabilities. Our Community and Culture Council that we created this year continues, and our Youth Arts Council are actively engaged with planning and executing events on our stages that are showcasing more and more marginalized artists. Our internal work continues to ensure that our venues are safe and welcoming, not only for all of our audience, but as well as our diverse staff. So we continue to invest heavily in this work. Next slide, please. Metro has two strategic target areas that P5 has a role in. The first one being a resilient economy. We try to invest in training. We participate in Merck's first opportunity target area, which gives our people a first chance at interviewing for positions that they could be qualified. Plus, we have a very robust culture and community department to help inform and lead our work. And that helps keep P5 focused on social equity, not as a check the box, but in everything that we do at P5. Next slide, please. The second target area is Metro's meeting our climate and resilience goal. Our sustainability efforts continue to grow. Capital and maintenance projects are thoroughly reviewed through a sustainability lens. And our work doesn't, while our work doesn't fit the Metro's third strategic area of homelessness, I did want to mention, however, that we feel our involvement with homeless youth in our youth education programs is definitely worth noting here. Next slide, please. So that concludes kind of a broad overview of P5's FY25 budget. I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Colleagues, any questions? Councilor Lewis.
Sure, thank you so much. Thank you for your work, particularly the increase to the investments in security. That's definitely been felt by audiences as well as artists and folks in the theater. So as we see folks coming downtown, downtown is back and we have the opportunity to help reorient the narrative of downtown as a place to go for creativity, arts, culture, and food, not just business. I have a couple of questions. In terms of the pie chart, two questions. One, the 15% government money, what flavor of government monies? And then the 3% other, does that represent the P5 Foundation, or where is the P5 Foundation represented in your global budget?
So the public funding is money that comes from the city of Portland that goes towards maintenance of the buildings. It's about 1.2, 1.3 million out of about a $60 million budget. So it's, not insubstantial, but still a relatively small part of the budget. That's the only public fund. Oh, we also get lodging tax revenue as well. As far as the other, that's like investment, interest. We do get funds from the Portland 5 Foundation. The Portland 5 Foundation 100% funds our youth education program, which averages around between 100,000 to 130,000 a year. So it's a really good investment.
Okay, so those would be represented in the other category from that pie chart?
Was that included? Well, the other, I don't know. We certainly have it in the budget as a revenue offset, but I don't know in the pie chart.
We can get you that information.
Okay, thank you. I think it's really important that we look at the budget holistically as a set of investments that we have influence on. And the P5 Foundation, I think of as a partner in this work. So I would hope it gets represented in that story. And then coming to 15% revenue expectation growth. Is that just in terms of volume, or did rates increase? Or are we projecting this is just because it's a good year?
It's really the strength of the year. A large part of it is Broadway, which is selling very, very strongly, and the fact that we have 11 weeks of very strong shows. But we're also seeing our commercial concerts and comedians and that side of the business pull in very strong numbers. We're close to sellout or selling out the majority of those shows. So those combined, but Broadway being really the big one, is largely behind our success for next year.
Okay, great, thank you. I just want to put it out there on public record that we hear a lot from folks about the rate increase from a year ago, and I don't want us to jump up again unanticipated or without a ramp up, which we could disagree on how much notice folks had, but it felt very sudden for people that we're hearing from. My hope is that we can stabilize rates for particularly nonprofit and resident companies.
We'd be happy to have a conversation with you about how we sustain P5. So,
yeah, thank you.
Councilor Rosenthal.
Thank you, Deputy Chair. First of all, I want to thank you for the presentation. I appreciate the fact that you're juggling a whole bunch of balls and keeping things, there's a lot of things to keep in mind, and it's a broad range of perspectives dealing with diversity, dealing with safety, dealing with training people up, and also dealing with environmental concerns and control. So I appreciate that. There's a lot of facets there. The one quick question I had was, I noticed there was a 15% increase in revenues and a 12% increase in costs, and yet a 7% increase in deficit. Is that primarily or entirely due to the capital needs? Okay.
yes,
Yeah, the roof is a big part of that.
the roof is a big
Okay.
part.
Thanks.
I see our funding balance or operating ending balance is at $1.8 million. What was it before the pandemic? Like, it was a healthy fund balance.
Do you not remember?
With thanks to the grant of $10 million that affected their fund balance. At one time it was 14 million was about the height, but the two big projects that impacted that were the cooling tower and the roof combined are roughly 12 million that drew that down to the number it's at on the presentation.
And what do you consider to be a healthy, I guess, reserve or end balance?
What's a rule of thumb? The Merck Commission at one point had asked for 6 months of operating as a reserve. Sitting on aging buildings, I don't think that's adequate. Because if you've seen, any one out of the blue can become a project that could be multi-million dollars in cost. And so our fund balance is very susceptible to that. So I personally would like a fund balance that's equal to my annual budget. It's big, but we've had that before. But we're in very, I think we're in a real precarious position because of the aging buildings that we have. So in assuming that everything stays status quo, that we're funding our own capital and capital maintenance, that's going to continue to hit our any reserves that we have faster than we can replace the reserves. So that's one of the pieces I think that we're going to need to have some really serious conversations around these venues and how we pay for its capital needs.
So we've been drawing down our fund balance, and because of capital, we haven't been able to replenish it. And there's not really a strong plan right now to rebuild those. So we're kind of just in this precarious position until we have that difficult conversation. Is that right?
Precarious is somewhat of a good word. It's a little bit unique how the fund balances are viewed within the venues. Again, with capital needs, with city engagement in that. We have in the future, I think fiscal 27 is a bond through the VFIGA for $40 million to invest in P5 capital. So that's money that's out ahead of us a little bit, but you know, that's kind of the backstop, I guess, that you would see for the way that we look at that. We continue to work with the city. We know we've got opportunities with our IGA to figure those things out. So it's not ideal, but there's a few levers in the future that, you know, we're going to be able to pull to help out. That being said, you know, the thought of another cooling tower going out or another big capital project is a whole different discussion. So that's kind of the situation we're in.
I also want to say that our operating budget, if you pull capital out, we're still not in a sustainable position. Our expenses are outpacing our revenues. It's largely personnel. Now, we have a big chunk of personnel whose costs we pass on to others, but there's also a lot of personnel that we don't, that we have to cover the costs of. So that's been a hefty thing for us. We subsidize the nonprofit users' use of our halls more deeply than virtually any performing arts centers in the US. And we have the data that shows that. So it's great if we can afford it, but if we can't, we're going to have to figure out a solution or there'll be no P5. So we're going to have to figure out what are the levers that we can pull to make sure that we can continue to care for these buildings, you know, provide for our audiences and our shows, and keep in business in a way that keeps us as affordable as we can be, but still allows us to operate this business.
Thank you. Councilor Nolan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You asked most of the questions I had teed up, but it provokes a follow-on from that. Two questions. One is, given that we have something of a systemic deficit in our operations, clearly, pretty simple arithmetic. You either bring in more money or you spend less. How do we compare? You mentioned, Robin, that we are among the most generous venues compared with our peer group around the country for supporting our local nonprofit organizations. How do we stack up with our peers for corporate support for our venues operating?
So
people like to contribute to capital because they can see it, touch it, maybe put their name on it. But how do we compare in terms of keeping the value that's been invested in actually functioning in the purpose it's supposed to be?
So I would break that question down in kind of two areas. There's performing arts centers that are managed by governmental entities and performing arts centers that are run by 501c3s. Many of the 501c3s, they are the presenter of Broadway. And so it's the revenue that they make from Broadway, and they can leverage Broadway for donations and things that help, you know, balance their budgets. We're not the presenter of Broadway. We're a partner, and it's certainly very important to us economically. But my colleagues who are actually presenting make a lot more money by being the presenter. I think governmental entities struggle more. I would say that many of my colleagues they get more support from their governments in many cases. I think one of our challenges, we're a big organization. We have 5 theaters, which is very unique. We're doing a lot of shows, and that takes a lot of staff to do it. So, you know, when we're doing 800 performances a year, it makes it hard to cut people when we have to do the shows. So I think that, and because we are really deeply subsidizing our arts organizations, let me give you an example. A 2,000 seat theater resident company rate averages around 4,000 to 4,500 a day for a performance. We charge a resident company less than 1,000 a day. So that's really the systemic problem that P5 has, which many years ago, when our costs were a little more controllable and we were able to really drop money to the bottom line regularly, we could sustain that, but we can't sustain it anymore. Our personnel costs are through the roof. And so, you know, we either have to lay off a lot of staff because that's our most expensive piece of the budget is personnel. And that would make it very hard to do the volume of business that we're doing. Or, you know, we're going to have to, you know, recuperate more of those costs. We're not going to be able to subsidize our groups as deeply as we have been. The P5 Foundation found it very difficult to get donors to donate money for infrastructure, boilers, chillers, air handlers, that sort of thing, which is why they pivoted to fund our education program, because donors understood that piece and the importance and so forth. And I think, you know, raising money for a governmental entity can be a bit of a challenge. There seems to be a philosophy, well, like, let the government take care of it, which really is
And
not.
lower my taxes
Right.
at the same time.
Exactly. So, so yeah, I mean, P5 has been in this position in the full 24 years that I've been here. But our costs are not where they were. You know, coming out of COVID, all of our costs are so much higher. And so we're going to have to figure out then what's the mix? How do we become sustainable? And those are kind of the conversations that we're having with the Merck Commission and we need to have with you.
I agree that we need to have them. I am quite nervous about an ending fund balance of $1.8 million. That's a minor hiccup of a capital need, and we are in debt. We're in deficit. Those conversations need to have, and I'm looking at you, Robin, and at Steve. With Merck, with the council, maybe your 100% annual operating is too far. But if a standard industry, and I certainly know in other kinds of facilities, a 6-month operating contingency or appropriate, I would like for the council in early order, as in sometime over this summer, be engaged in conversations about putting us on a glide slope to get to, first of all, determining what the appropriate reserve is. And this probably applies to all the venues, and how we get there. I understand you're raising and pointing out the biggest part of our expense side, but for me, raising rates or reducing support for our local nonprofits is not an option that would be in my top 10.
Okay, Councilor Rosenthal.
Thank you, Deputy Chair. Just first of all, how far can we project what our labor costs will be? If I remember, we signed some contracts, and I'm not clear whether they were 1, 2 year, 3 year contracts that give us some ability to project those costs going forward. And then the other question is it correct to assume that we may be seeing some significant, or I should say that the decision on what to do with the Keller is going to affect the projections going forward in different ways, depending on what the decision is? In other words.
So our labor contracts are usually a 3-year contract, so we can project that far out.
Okay.
And as far as the Keller, the Keller is really the big money maker of my 3 buildings. We rely on them very heavily. They're like more than 50% of my total revenues just from that building. And it takes the Keller and the Schnitzer to really fund the Hatfield, who largely serves much smaller more fragile arts organizations. So the Keller is a very, very important piece to that, which is why we've got some concerns about closing down for any period of time if a renovation option is chosen, just because, you know, what do we do without that revenue for 2 or 3 years is a real problem. But we're still kind of working our way through the conversations on all the options for the Keller.
It was presented that the renovation would actually have an impact on Broadway shows for about 2 years or more. Then, and that's correct, isn't it?
Yes, Broadway starts booking the tours together about 2 to 3 years out, particularly the really big shows or you know, start planning their routing. And if the Keller is closed for renovation, the shows won't even temporarily book a tour. They can't risk losing millions of dollars and a building's not suddenly open when they're pegged to play there. So they will bypass us, will fall out of the rotation. It's taken this region a long time to build to the number of subscribers that we currently have, because we're not on the Eastern Seaboard where there's a whole lot of shows coming out of New York one after the other, and there's a lot of product. We're having to pull from New York to like Denver, and then we rely on Seattle to help pull to the north and bring some shows down to us, or from the South in California, where it's a challenging tour schedule. And Broadway Across America has worked really hard to build that business to where it's really high, but are very concerned that if they go several years without any Broadway, they said it's going to be a slow build back. They told me it's taken them 29 years to build to their current level. So.
Councilor Lewis.
Sure, thank you. While we're talking specifically about buildings, I was hoping to focus in on the other old hall, the Schnitzer, where we've had AC failure, roof, and at the same time, we've made some really wonderful investments, the new shell and so on, for you know, making sure that we are state of the art. Can you forecast out how we are going to have conversations with the city of Portland? They own that building, but it's continuing to age, like as every building is. But we have to draw a line somewhere between what it means to operate and what it means to actually hold a capital asset. And with a roof, I feel like we're right at that line. And I'd like your projection as to when we need to reopen that conversation with city.
I mean, we need that conversation immediately. You want to speak to that, Steve?
Yeah, and what that looks like is our last facility condition assessment was in 2016. And so we've been in discussions with the city throughout the first quarter of this calendar year. And our plan is to have an updated facility condition assessment this summer. Obviously, you know, some hurdles and et cetera to get through on that, but to really get a good understanding, because, well, we think there's a lot of capital versus here's what the facilities condition assessment has to say. Here's how we're going to utilize this. Here's the monies that are going to be earmarked towards that. So that's kind of what, you know, the formality that's been lacking in these decisions and in these discussions. So that is happening, like I said, hopefully this summer.
Wonderful. I hope you bring some of that to us at council.
Happy to.
Thank you.
Can I, oh, please. Sorry, if we're about to move on, I wasn't sure. I just wanted to add one more thought about P5. I actually really appreciate the conversation, and I think it's really helpful to hear from councilors about some of the values as we think about where P5 is going in the future. And I think, Councilor Nolan, to your point, it would be good to have a follow-up, more lengthy conversation, because I just want to acknowledge that, you know, some of the things like raising fees and rates, if that is not a direction council wants to go, it's one of our only levers. And so taking that lever off the table just reduces sort of the overall options for P5. And so I think it would be good to really walk through what those levers are that we have. We are not comfortable, I want to be really clear, with an ending fund balance this low. And we wanted to be really clear about this, you know, proposed budget. We had, you know, quite a few conversations about, you know, how do we talk about this? We think we can manage through this next year, but it is not a sustainable position to be in the long run. And if the desire of this council is also, to stabilize rates for production companies and, some of those other things, that makes it even more challenging as we look at a 3 to 5 year cycle. So I actually think it would be good to come back and have some longer conversations about what those levers are and what that looks like and what the trade-offs are.
Thank you, Andrew.
And I'll just add to that, as Councilor Lewis is aware that, the city is set off on their cultural planning, which again, this is not a P5 issue. This is a greater regional issue with funding for the arts. And those discussions and those committees and those stakeholder outreaches have been happening. So there's a lot going on right now. Once the dust settles, we'll be better informed to, okay, here's the action that we need to take. Here's how we can accomplish it. Here's the adjustments that we need to make in how we do business. But, those things are coming to an end here in a few months as well.
Thank you.
And I will say that from a hour time slot, we're quite a bit over for P5 and happy to answer as many questions as you like, but would maybe recommend that we move forward and follow back up with if there are additional questions.
That sounds great. Let's move on then.
Good morning, Metro Deputy Council President Huang, Metro councilors and staff and guests. My name is Matthew Rochford. I'm the Executive Director of the Portland Expo Center, and I use he and him pronouns. Very pleased to be here today to present the fiscal 24 budget for the Portland Expo Center. Joining me today is Ashley Sloan, the Finance Manager of Merck Visitor Venues. Also want to recognize the efforts of Metro Finance, the visitor venue teams, our amazing Expo staff. Chuck Dills, our Ops and Capital Projects Manager, Sabrina Catalina, Expo's Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Liaison, as well as the guidance and counsel of the Merck Commission in preparing the budget presented before you today. Next slide, please. Today, I will be following the same format you have seen previously. We will begin today with Expo's Department Investment Progress, highlighting some key accomplishments over the past year. Ashley will then present the budget overview of revenues and expenses for the Expo Center, including any notable items as well as a financial overview. I will then share some notable facts related to our budget performance measures, our key equity metric, and the progress we have made in the areas of DEI. And lastly, the 3 investment target areas as requested by council. We'll follow up with budget modifications, and it is my goal to leave with you enough time to answer any questions that you may have or any follow-up. Next slide, please. The Expo has enjoyed a number of positive successes this past fiscal year. We have a strong client base. The Expo continues to benefit from many long-standing community partnerships within a changing environment. We are very thankful for our wonderful clients and the diverse events they bring to our campus. Events such as the Rose City Classic Dog Show, the Metro RV Dealers Association, the Roadster Show, and the Pacific Northwest Sportsman Show, to name a few, all welcome large crowds through our doors. In addition, public events like ThriftCon, Snovana, Red Cube Concerts, and Rose City Vintage all continue to grow in popularity. These events and more, in addition to the new events we have welcomed, all add to a vibrant calendar year. The Expo is a hub for face-to-face business and job creation. The Expo Center also hosts a number of diverse events with partners like the Friends of Baseball, Vanport Mosaic, the Japanese American Museum of Oregon, the Islamic Center of Portland, and others. Staff participate in the Expo Features Historic Significance and Memorialization Committee and gain from training and unique experiences. Alongside welcoming signage, we collaborate with our clients to establish new traditions for anthems and opening ceremonies and other cultural elements, fostering a sense of place and positive beginnings for shows and competitions. We've also expanded growth in our sports markets. With expert assistance from Sport Oregon and Travel Portland, the Expo has expanded our sports offerings to over 3 weekends of volleyball happening right now with the Columbia Empire Volleyball Association and then the Willamette Classic. We've also added the North American Gay Volleyball Association visiting in 2025. With other events such as Major League Table Tennis, American Cornhole League, the Juneteenth Rodeo last year, and even DOA Wrestling, the Expo has made large strides in expanding into emerging sports markets, as noted in the recent sports ETA conference held at the Convention Center last week. The updated scheduling policies also serve to assist in these efforts. Lastly, our teams have made huge and significant strides in advancing pre-sales for our ticketing, parking, and exhibitor services. With these efforts, we can be in touch with our patronage, accelerate our service levels, and modernize our service delivery. Our focus is to get our patrons and exhibitors onto the show and focused on having fun and generating sales at their event. The Expo Center is a hub for economic generation, community building, and unique hobbies and competitions. The staff are there to be commended for their daily efforts in welcoming the public and helping them meet their goals safely and securely. I'll now ask Ashley to present Expo's budget details for you. Ashley, next slide, please.
Thanks, Matthew. Starting with resources, Expo is expecting a good year next year. They have a circ year, and then increasing parking rates by $1 equals $697,000 increase to revenue year over year. That looks like a total of 7.3 million, and that it also is including government funds of VFTA and TLT. We are projecting a tiny, about 20% increase from the financial review team. All of those add to Expo's revenue for next year. Expenditures are up 15%. That's $1 million year over year. Personnel is being increased 648,000. They are increasing their FTE by 0.8. That is having 2 positions rounded up. So we had 2 part-time positions that are now going to be 1 FTEs. So that plus increase of wages equals 648,000 year over year increase. Material and services are up 14%, and that's mostly being driven by market factors, and utilities are up 15 to 20% as well. Operating deficit is being projected at 635,000, and that does include a $400,000 Metro transfer. We do want to note that it is the last year of the debt service. That's 1.1 million in expenses yearly, so that's a huge burden off for next year's budget. Not for FY25, but for the year after that's budget. Next slide, please. Capital projects are going to be 1.1 million. It's a 23% increase year over year, and most of that, or 600 of it, is HVAC replacements. These are going to be paid from the fund balance since we are in a deficit position. We are projecting a fund balance of 350,000. And the FTE, as I said, it goes from 17 to 17.8 with the increases for the parking and ticketing services and utility lead positions. I'll hand it back to you, Matthew.
Next slide, please. Thank you. This slide shares a number of areas where we track data year over year. And as in this case of our fiscal 23 economic impact report that showcases over 30 million total output in direct or indirect spending, 210 jobs, and 12.6 million in labor income earnings, and 2.3 in local and state tax revenue. The Expo is indeed an economic driver for our region. Some highlights from our other areas include sustainability, noting over 200 pounds of honey from our Expo Bee project. Our next harvest will be in September. Also, during the last Circ event, we moved over 7,500 local cans of Eclectic's Lago IPA right here in Portland. We hope to surpass that number in the upcoming run of Cirque's Cuza with this new partnership. Next slide, please. The Expo Center is also the home for not only numerous and long-standing public events, but also as a place for community gatherings, prayer services, celebrations, and reflection on what has taken place on this campus on and over the past 100 years. The Expo Center team is working with community to acknowledge the pain and hardship specific cultures have endured and creating opportunities for all in this place to grow as individuals and learn more. The Expo staff strives not only to make our guests feel safe and secure, but also welcomed on our campus as their place to grieve, honor, and celebrate. We are also making strides in these areas by creating a small $10,000 community support fund source that can assist these events may they need assistance in making their event a reality. As a team, we're also being mindful that we are already doing a lot with over 113,000 of in-kind partnerships and equipment brought to support our community partnerships. Some of the photos you see here, you can see the joy brought to the kids that were able to meet MLB star Adley Rushman, the pride of the inaugural Juneteenth rodeo, and the beauty of gatherings such as the recent Islamic prayer service. However, we also want to give our guests a chance to reflect on the site's significant history as the site of incarcerated Japanese Americans in 1942, the tragic consequences in numerous communities due to the Vanport flood in 1948, and historic impacts of displacement for our African American and other tribal partners as well. The Expo staff are working to create a campus that is sincerely welcoming that all can participate in. We're working with the Expo Futures team toward a meaningful memorialization of what took place on this campus. And the main thing I have learned over my long tenure here is there always is more to learn about this history and more ways to grow and connect with all of our neighbors that call this place home. Next slide, please. The Expo Center is a key driver for Metro and maintaining a resilient economy for all. As I noted in a summary, there's over 30 million in economic impacts, and Expo is indeed open for business and looking for more. With the partnerships within our Portland area sports community or other areas, the Expo Futures Project envisions an even greater impact on our communities. A few notable items here for our climate resilient goals are a continued championing of our stormwater green wall and our climate success story for clean water and rivers. Capital is to review and replace our HVAC units towards more sustainable and modern options. And lastly, the Expo remains hopeful in our quest to be successful in our partnerships to bring about the largest solar panel project in the Metro agency over our large barrel roofs. Next slide, please. The Expo additionally supports housing for all through the driving of tax revenues that support our Metro housing projects and Multnomah County's efforts. Through these efforts of our staff and partners, we've developed a stronger partnership with the Blanchet House and others supporting a variety of programs for housing and those in need. Next slide, please. There were no budget modifications requested last year, but in fiscal 25, there is a request from the general fund for operating support of $400,000. In addition, there are 2 current variable hour and event-based positions for both represented and non-represented staff. These 2 requests are moving VHE positions from a 0.5 to a 1.0 and a 0.7 to a 1.0. We feel these impacts of these job creations not only support the needs of parking, ticketing, and operations departments, but also create career track jobs much needed in our venues and other community assets. Next slide, please. Thank you, counselors. Appreciate your continued support and time and attention. If you have any questions for me today, I'd be happy to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. Questions? Councilor Rosenthal.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. 2 quick questions. One is, I was noticing on the capital that, and maybe I just don't understand HVAC very well, that's probably the case, that the $600,000 for the next year, and then it lines out for the next few years at the same amount. My thinking would be, oh, you can fix it and then you can just sort of use it for the next few years. Can I get a little, and then I noticed it balloons in 1 year to twice that much. There must be a explanation. That's the first question. The second question is, there's at some point we may make a decision on how to enhance sports activities, and that will be there may be capital expenditures that are projected there. Is that expected for the next budget cycle, not this budget cycle?
Towards your first question, the draft information that you received in your packet, there are a number of changes that I noted myself when I was looking at this. We took a lot of the numbers and cut programs to put towards the HVAC system. So there is a over 3.6 over time, but it is front loaded. And our capital project manager and ops manager, Chuck Dills, is leading that charge. Lastly, in terms of equipment and improvements, there are some other types of improvements here, but I think the Expo Futures project over time, once that completed work is done, they'll be able to delineate which projects and purchases would be made to advance those causes.
So we might see something further on that next year.
Yeah, our focus right now is making sure that our flagship buildings are going to be upgraded and in great working order.
And as an example, similar challenges as P5, a little bit different. So for the HVAC, there was a plan to spend over 4 years and to do 2 of the, how many total units?
That would be 8 on Hall E and 6 on D.
Yeah, so 14 total units, right? So just changing 2 out helps a lot, which is why you see that. We made the decision this year to front load. So we could have, protected that fund balance, but it just made more sense financially and for care of the building to front load some of that after a healthy year last year and to be able to spend that up front. So that's kind of the challenge that we're faced with deferred maintenance, especially coming out of COVID. But that was a strategic decision this year, specifically with that HVAC project.
Okay.
Great, Counselor Lewis.
Sure, thank you so much. Thank you for bringing forward into light the investment in bringing your staff into regular full-time employment. I think that means a lot, particularly in an industry that is so dependent on variable hour. Do you have any remaining staff that you would seek to, in future years, move from variable hour to regular status or bring up in their FTE?
I think perhaps, but at this time, those are the main two that we focused on. We're not accustomed to asking for a lot, so we appreciate this effort and we'll look at that. I think we run a very tight ship with a small team, but the expenses are great, so we try to make those balances.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Counselor Rosenthal.
Oh, I'm sorry. Hit the wrong button.
Am I just understanding correctly in the actual for fiscal year 23, you basically broke even, and then in 24 there was a loss was that from capital as well, for 1.3 million roughly in loss from
a buy down.
Oh, yes, that's mainly a switch in our capital project efforts and the cuts that were made to some projects, again, to force most of the monies towards this front loading of the HVAC system. We did not want to repeat, as has happened unfortunately in other buildings.
Great,
These are 25-year-old systems that need replacing now.
Thanks for the clarification. And even on the bottom of the balance sheet, I see there's a fund balance line and a contingency ending fund balance. Are those two different buckets, or is that just am I supposed to look at the ending fund balance line?
I would look at the ending fund balance line. Contingency is going to make it so that the budget equals the revenues and the expenditures, and the contingency gives us room if there are other expenses, but I mostly focus on the fund balance, ending balance.
Okay, so the ending fund balance we're anticipating next year is 349,000. And again, like what?
That is correct, but strategically over the past 2 fiscal years, knowing that the debt service is ending, it's been an approach that we're doing now, hopefully that, coming back with that rebound with that 1.1, being able to drop through the bottom line next year. It's certainly a positive in this fiscal proposed budget that CERC is within it, but because of rising costs, we were not able to balance it in this particular budget. I am in talks with them to hoping bring them back more often. So that's our hope.
And same question as P5, what was a healthy end balance?
Again, I believe, 6 months, I think as we've spoken earlier, is a good, strong number for us.
So about 1.5 million.
Again, it's just a lot of unknowns with the halls A, B, and C. There's a lot of deferred maintenance with the Expo Center property that is perhaps not all reflected here. But on any walking tour that you would have with Chuck Dills, our operations manager, he'd be more than happy to show you just in person. It speaks for itself in some regard. But we have a path. There's a way to get there and make these really a gem for our community. So I'm excited about the work in the future.
Okay, thank you very much. Councilor Nolan.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I want to compliment you on the equity measures that you've presented and the progress you're making on them. It takes a good bit for an organization to absorb and understand that their target is not how many widgets they make or how many shows they put on, but how that is embraced by the community support for it. And yours are really moving in that direction with the particular shows that you're hosting and the local communities that are embracing them. So thanks. I do have one question, and maybe this is for the finance side. In P5 and Expo, you've essentially put the operating and capital budgets together in that capital operates out of any surplus operating revenue, or if there isn't any, then it goes to a reserve. So it seems to me with the ask for $400,000 from the general fund that you could say, we're asking the general fund to pay our debt service, or we're asking the general fund to pay for the personnel increases we're asking, or we're asking the general fund to pay for one or two of the air conditioning units. Did you go through a prioritization process? And how did you decide where to draw the line?
If I could just clarify, prioritization on the capital projects or?
Well, on the entire budget, because there are government entities that treat capital and operating strictly separately. I don't read your budget proposals as doing that, because you pay for capital out of operating surplus if there is some. So what I'm saying is, in terms of when you're prioritizing particularly expenses that exceed current year revenues, how did you prioritize which ones you'd ask for above the line and which ones you'd go to the general fund pool for?
That's an excellent question, Councilor Nolan. I think to your first point about the operating versus capital, part of the reason for that in the case of the venues is right now, in the past, we used to have some different sources of money that were restricted for capital purposes. But generally, right now, we're looking at one pot for operations and capital. And so the process the department went through really was prioritizing their budget and building kind of what they think they needed for that fiscal year, and then making a request to the general fund. In terms of our process, we were really looking at the general fund ask in total, and whether it was for capital or part of the operations was really irrelevant. It was about this package that was presented, that was prioritized by the department, and what was the level of general fund support necessary to get them to a place that we felt was an acceptable level of fund balance for the fiscal year.
Maybe if I ask the question a different way. If Brian, you shake out the general fund's pockets and we don't have $400,000 to give Expo, what would you not do, Mitch or Steve?
There could be some changes to our capital funding line, definitely. There could be some changes to things like the community fund that I expressed.
Well, I know there could be all those things. I'm asking you two to tell me which you would recommend not being done.
I think the answer is because they submitted that capital project as a general fund request, if that was not funded, that is what would not be done.
The air conditioning.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
And Brian, if you could introduce yourself for record.
Sorry, Brian Kennedy, Chief Financial Officer, he, him pronouns.
Thank you. More questions? Thank you, Matthew. Can we move on to Convention Center?
Good afternoon, Metro Council Deputy President Wong, councilors. My name is Craig Stroud and I'm Executive Director of the Oregon Convention Center. I use he, him pronouns. It's my pleasure to present OCC's fiscal 25 budget with you today. I'm going to move quickly because I know you're going to have questions and I know we're running long, but bear with me, please. Our presentation agenda, next slide, is structured to provide all the information that you requested. It's slightly in a different order because I wanted to just tell a very consistent story, or it fit better for the story, but it's all in there. Next slide. This slide details OCC's first performance metric, which is annual economic impact, jobs supported, and taxes generated from our events. The top row on the table is fiscal year 2019, the last full year of events prior to the pandemic. In fiscal 23, we completed our second year of reopening, and performance metrics capture the region's slow hospitality sector recovery. Fewer or less attended national conventions at OCC reduces our economic impact, jobs, and taxes generated. Thousands of regional hospitality jobs, from rideshare providers to hotel and restaurant staff, are negatively impacted as regional visitors to conventions, as well as travel related to leisure and business, continues to lag pre-pandemic levels. Next slide. The second performance metric notes the count of conventions and large consumer shows by fiscal year. Next year's contracted 47 events is at the low end of the historic average. Fiscal years 26 and 7 numbers are very low and concerning. We're working hard to increase these numbers. Next slide. Our third performance metric is around sustainability. OCC was recertified by the U.S. Green Building Council LEED Platinum existing building this past year. LEED is a comprehensive model that captures the totality of OCC's sustainability practices and investments. We are proud of our sustainability leadership within the convention industry. LEED Platinum is the highest green building certification and demonstrates OCC's continued commitment to sustainable practices. Each renewal cycle, the performance criteria increases, which pushes our team to continually invest and do more. Next slide. In last year's budget, council approved one new full-time position, a training and development coordinator. This new position and several other vacant positions across OCC departments have been put on hold for hiring due to OCC's financial condition. While this is unfortunate, we will continue to innovate and deliver services using existing resources, and I'm confident we will perform well. I'm now handing off to Ashley Sloan, OCC's finance manager, to provide the numeric budget overview.
Thanks, Craig. Start with revenue. OCC is in a similar position as the other venues. They're going to have government contributions, flat TLT, slight increase to the VFDA funds. Their charges for services are up 5%, which is $1.4 million year over year. So they're going from a $28 million budget this year to 29.8 next year. Next slide, please. And their expenses are also going up. The way that Craig has controlled that is that personnel is only going up 2%, and that is accomplished by defunding 5 positions. Materials and services are up 3%, and that's mostly driven by utilities and market influences like the other venues. Next slide. That does leave us with an operating deficit of 1.1 million. Capital outlay is 7.1 million, and that will be paid from the fund balance because of the deficit position. And the ending fund balance projection is 12.6 million. I'll hand it back to Craig.
Next slide, please. So to give you some context, OCC's has 3 relatively balanced revenue sources. Top right in the blue chunk is food and beverage revenues, and we continue to observe a shift to more retail concessions and walk-up outlets coming out of the pandemic as opposed to catering revenues. For example, in February of this year, a convention with 2,500 attendees did not offer catering meals to general attendees. That's just unheard of pre-pandemic. Catering is a more efficient delivery system, generates larger revenues, and has greater financial margins than retail does. In addition, on our sustainability side, we can better reduce food waste and minimize garbage with catering services. Top left in the gray is transit lodging taxes that continue to support OCC, continue to lag pre-pandemic levels. It's important for me to note here when I'm talking about pre-pandemic, I'm talking about dollars that are 2019 dollars. And we know that the value of a dollar today is not what it was then. We have yet to catch up to 2019 levels for hospitality revenues and taxes generated in the region. We do know, based on the work of the financial review team that manages transient lodging taxes, we can expect 10% below 2019 levels in 25 and 26. And then finally, we are experiencing increased client price insensitivity for rental and other offered event services. Many of our typical association convention clients are also financially recovering from the pandemic and are mindful and conservative in their event spending. In summary, with all 3 funding sources facing headwinds, OCC is cautiously approaching the fiscal year 25 budget. Next slide. Talk a little about our operating environment. Our national reputation for safety and livability conditions continues to suppress business. This slide shows the photo that accompanied the New York Times front page story that was one of 4 critical articles from last summer and fall. These articles resonate with national clients and event attendees and drive negative sentiment. Across the country, the hospitality industry is at or above pre-pandemic levels of business, and Portland is an outlier given its slow recovery. Forecasts indicate that Portland, again, won't reach pre-pandemic levels until fiscal years 26 or 7. Next slide. Now, I know this is a busy slide, and I don't need you to read all the details. I need you to just take the takeaway from the colors here. If you look at the colors, the important takeaway in the top is that orange is bad. We book way out into the future, and hotels rooms associated with our business is a great indicator of how well we're performing. If you look at the top heat map from 2024 and out the next 8 years, you can see there's a lot of orange, a bit of white, and a handful of blue. Orange means we're behind pace. Darker orange means we're significantly behind pace. Contrast that to the lower slide from December of 2020. Nearly everything was in a blue or white state, meaning we are on pace or ahead of pace. These two maps represent the opposite ends of the business development spectrum, and we have work ahead to address the slow business recovery of our region. Next slide. Some of the steps we're taking, OCC with our regional hospitality partners are aggressively pursuing convention business. That underwrites all the other activity that happens within the center. Aggressively pursuing looks like continued sales team peak travel to develop future business opportunities with clients, coupled with discounted rental and services to increase our market competitiveness. To the right there is an existing promotion that runs through the end of this year. We're using such promotions to try to get clients to choose Portland or other options they have on the West Coast. Next slide. In addition, Travel Portland, with financial support from our national marketing and sales contract, is strategically marketing to convention planners and, importantly, to site selection decision makers to address hesitation related to Portland's reputation. Targeted efforts to decision makers is key to improving the future business pipeline. These kinds of ads will run in LinkedIn. There'll be in national news periodicals targeting specific types of decision makers. And then we try to bring them on site in Portland so they can see for themselves the conditions on the streets, the vibrancy of the hospitality community, and it's a juxtaposition to what they're reading or what they think of the city and what's happening. But it's definitely an uphill battle right now, but we've seen some great wins. Next slide. Importantly, we continue to address safety and livability issues to build client confidence to choose Portland for their events. I'm excited to share the Convention District Safe Connect program, supported with a grant from the Visitor Development Fund and administered by the Portland Metro Chamber and Downtown Clean and Safe. The program will provide public safety staff in the blocks adjacent to the convention center and support along the routes walked to reach East Side Convention Center hotels. In addition to providing increased public safety visibility, agents will provide information and wayfinding support and intentional relationship building with hotel and business staff. The program is slated to launch in July. This would be a complement to the Central East Side Safety Program they've recently stood up. Downtown Clean and Safe and the Hotel District have recently stood up a safety program, and TriMet has stood up a safety program for its platforms and along its routes. There are other important safety considerations. I'm happy to speak to those. You have them in your materials. Suffice to say, there's been a lot of investment and there will continue to be investment in public safety. Next slide. So OCC shares Metro Council's desire to ensure the center is convening and supporting diverse events and attendees. OCC matched last year's diverse group event percentage of 11% with more than 35,000 attendees in those events. Work is ongoing to increase the percentage of diverse group events in the future. Next slide. And this slide lists examples of the types of diverse groups and conventions, both local and nationally, that use the center in fiscal 24. As you can see, it's a wide and varied listing of events. Next slide. My personal favorite.
Can I just
Yes.
get a reference point? You
Yes.
said 35,000 attendees. What's your total attendance?
About 350,000. No, total attendees. I'd have to look at I'm thinking of last year's number. Can I get that back to you?
Well, I'm trying to compare them.
Yeah, next slide will be helpful in that overall use.
Thanks.
Yeah, I'm sorry, should have given that to you. My personal favorite from the last year, and this is just a really great slide, was the National Veterans Wheelchair Games over the 4th of July holiday. More than 500 athletes from across the nation convened to participate in 22 competitive sports at this national event. Most of the events took place at OCC, but some took place in other venues across the region, such as the pool at Mount Hood Community College. Next slide. So, Councilor Nolan, diverse groups is only a portion of the community use of the center.
Right.
You can see from this short list of examples that groups and clients are fundraising for local community needs, nurturing small business owners, and celebrating union jobs at the center. All told, here's your statistic, diverse group, community, and small businesses use of the center will total about 193,000 individuals this year across 78 events. That's roughly a third of all of OCC's business. Next slide. Some investments in target areas, particularly around DEI efforts. Colas Construction's successful renovation of OCC in 2019 marked a pivotal moment in OCC's journey and commitment to driving equitable outcomes. To build on the success, we've embarked on the Albina Acknowledgement Project to tell the story of our historic impact on the Albina community through a space that is intended to support reflection, inspiration, and gathering. In addition, we're finalizing a June event to obtain feedback from local event professionals who plan diverse group activities. This collaboration will help us identify and understand the barriers to community and cultural organizations hosting events within the OCC. From this feedback, we'll then take steps to develop a structured program to support more diverse group use of the center in the future. Next slide. With this slide, I'm excited to announce OCC's new Career Development Scholarship Program. This new program is piloted at $25,000 in fiscal year 25 and is designed to support employee career advancement. The program is intended to allow training opportunities that support an employee's future in a position outside of their current work unit, but within an existing Metro job classification. Given the breadth of Metro services and operations, there's a lot of opportunity across the agency for our teams and staff. This new funding is on top of the $150,000 budgeted for training across all OCC divisions that is focused on job-specific and work unit skills development. Next slide. Like my colleagues, maintaining the center requires continual capital investment. This slide outlines 26 projects that total $22 million in OCC's 5-year capital improvement plan. OCC is diligent to ensure we support Metro and partner public benefit programs when making these investments. Next slide. In summary, OCC's fiscal year 25 budget aggressively pursues business development to secure our future. As described earlier, cost containment tactics are in place to protect ending fund balance. We're also smartly keeping a long-term focus in decision-making to take advantage of opportunities. I've challenged the team to continue delivering exceptional services through innovation and improved service delivery tactics. We have positioned the fiscal year 25 budget to allow time for conditions to improve and stabilize our overall finances. Finally, this is late breaking. I'm excited to share that OCC is in final negotiations with a large consumer show for an event this fall and winter. Contracting so close to the dates of a large event is really rare for the convention center. We're optimistic that the show will move forward with us. If it does so, associated net revenues will likely drive the year to break even or even a bit net positive for the overall operations. Fingers crossed on that one. Next slide. Be happy to answer any questions you have.
Great. Thank you, Craig. Colleagues, Councilor Nolan.
Thanks. We heard in some of our other presentations that we've had about an 80% participation agency-wide in DEI mandatory management training. Do you by chance know, I guess I'm looking at you, Steve, or each individual venue, what your participation in those is?
Just had this discussion yesterday on OCC, who I think is the department leader throughout all Metro in their trainings. I don't have those, but let me get specifically the numbers by venue for you. Which is, we've got some new software that'll be easy to pull up. So I'll follow back up with an email to the council with those statistics.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I didn't expect you'd have that.
Yeah.
But I want to put it on the record because I want you all to know that it's important to the council.
Absolutely.
Second, I have a question both for Mitch and Greg. What percentage of your parking spaces provide electric vehicle charging capacity?
There are 2 charging stations at the Expo Center, but unfortunately they were damaged. Somebody took a bat to those and destroyed them. So they are under repair and are in line to be repaired. Chuck and the sustainability team are looking at other avenues to add more charging stations at Expo.
And for the convention center, we have 4 on each level of the parking garage. Utilization is extremely low. And I think it's really because for local attendees coming to the center, we're behind a paywall. So you have to park to pay to get into our garage.
Right.
And so we're not seeing transient type activity where people are in the neighborhood parking. They're coming to an event and they generally, well, I drive a vehicle. I have enough energy to get to the show and back home. So we see very little usage. That said, we are exploring, we know that the electrification of fleet bus vehicles and coaches and semi-trucks is coming. And so we're exploring how to provide those services because that would be necessary for particularly coaches that pull up curbside. They would need to recharge in order to get to their next destination. Same with trucks that are loading docks. So that seems to be our most obvious opportunity in the future for electrification for vehicles.
Great. I wouldn't have thought of that, but I'm glad you are.
Craig, just can you provide just an overview from the sales teams around what potential clients are saying about Portland and what their concerns are and also what our strengths are right now?
Yeah, I can. Thank you for the question, Councilor Wong. I think a great example is the Sports ETA event that concluded last week. Sports ETA is 500 individuals that are either license holders for events or they're actual event promoters, and they choose where in the country to bring their event. And so this particular event was an opportunity for Sport Oregon, Travel Portland, Expo Center, us, all of the other venues within the region to showcase not only what we can support for sports, but what the hospitality add-ons can look like. We consistently last week had event attendees who had a conception of what Portland was like from news they'd seen nationally over the course of time, particularly 2000 and forward. And they had a real perception around the condition of the city. And they, to the individual, every single person. And I had several conversations. I heard of probably a dozen conversations where some people actually apologized. They were sorry for having come in with preconceived ideas that the city was in a shape that it's not in. Now, there's been a lot of work that has happened by many partners, public and private, to address some of the livability conditions that we had. And that work is ongoing. We're not anywhere near to being done with that. But when we get people on the ground and we show them the city and we show them, from that amazing new airport that they're going to fly into all the way through the last restaurant they eat in, they're delighted. And it's inspiring confidence, but it takes those personal touches because, like I showed in the slide deck, the National New York Times article is so impactful to that perception of what's happening. That it takes very diligent and ongoing effort. One slide I did strip because of timing was Travel Portland does a national sentiment perception around the city. It was predominantly had trended negative and then, kind of seesawed back and forth over the last couple of years. This last quarter, it ticked up, I think, 8% negatively. And I can't for the life of me figure out what happened in the last quarter that would have done that. Other quarters I can look and say, oh, there was this news media or there was this event. So it's just an ongoing conversation. As far as, I guess from the sales perspective, there is a lot of business out there that's sitting in tentative, meaning they're looking at Seattle, they're looking at us, they're looking at Salt Lake City, all for the same year or range of years. We're trying to be ultra competitive in that, both in pricing and just in offering a value. So we're optimistic. We're seeing the turn. We've hit the bottom. We're seeing a turn, but we really need the city to continue to evoke that safety and welcoming presence that we were known for before the pandemic. We really were. From a capital perspective, we funded nearly $40 million of capital improvements just before the pandemic off of fund balance. That was money coming through transient lodging taxes dedicated to capital. I'd like to believe that the city will return to that level of performance and we can count on that money, but there's just not been enough time to know how much of this change we're experiencing is structural. All three of our slices of pie, each facing headwinds simultaneously. How much of that is structural and how much of that is just where we're at in this moment in time? That's one of the differences between our levels of business. We contract 10 years out. So we have such long lead times that it takes a year or two to see if something's just an anomaly or it's a real ongoing trend.
Thank you.
If I might follow up on that. Thanks, Mr. Chair. We've talked about it before, and forgive me for not keeping the numbers in my head. But the pandemic didn't only shut down venues and offices and all of that, but it taught Americans different ways to do business meetings. So my question is, what's the national convention pie looking like? Because it's how big is the pie and how much of it is our slice, both of those factors.
Well, I don't know the size of the pie. It's thousands and thousands of associations that hold national conventions and such. We don't chase the entire pie predominantly because they're not natural fits for us. Las Vegas, Houston, Orlando, they're taking the tier one largest conventions, 40, 50,000 attendees. We just can't compete. We don't have the hotel rooms. We don't have the airlift. We don't have the et cetera. So we really need to find our sweet spot, which is between a tier two and a tier one city. We compete a lot with Seattle. Seattle just doubled the size of their convention center, is now the largest convention center in the Northwest. They could literally hold 2 conventions that would fit in our building simultaneously across their 2 buildings. So they've tiered up. That provides opportunity for us to pull some of those clients down to us that are now maybe too small for Seattle, but right in our sweet spot. As far as what's happening in that space, it all depends. Our sweet spot is not medical. It's not really technology, which we're trying to change given the technology that lives in our region. We've had success historically there, but it's really nonprofit associations. And depending on who they are and what client they service, they either weathered pandemic extremely well financially, business continued, their clients and their attendee or their base, or they withered substantially. So it's really dependent. I mean, speaking in these high, broad generalities, very challenging. We also know that for any given slice of our pie and our sweet spot, we're only going to get a shot at those conventions every 3 years because of the way they cycle. They move to the East Coast to draw people from that geography, then the middle of the country, then West Coast or some permutation. They're moving north, they're moving south. They're trying to service all of these national folks that are part of their association. So there's a math to it and there's a science to it, but it's very, very particular to any one client.
If I could just add, I heard something a little bit different in part of your question about like, are people still traveling? Is there a virtual component where, you know, that's happening? Craig and I were in DC a couple weeks ago on some client visits, and that's a question I brought up to everyone. How's your attendance? How are they, you know, how's the virtual piece? The virtual piece in our world is almost non-existent. And this came up, you know, back in the sustainability bubble in the early 2000s in our industry of like, gosh, we're never going to have conferences again. And we realized that, you know, we're an industry of relationships, an industry of people, and the in-person is so critical. So outside of, you know, technology or education or science-based that are doing some virtual, people are coming, right? Attendance continues to be strong. So I think there was a little bit of meddling with that coming out of COVID. But I think everyone that I was very intentional in the questions I asked 5 or 6 meeting planners. They're like, yeah, we rarely even offer virtual anymore because we found that the demand for it was so minimal.
Thanks.
Okay. Agreed. Yeah, exactly.
Great. Well, thank you, Steve, and the whole team for managing through difficult times. It's a very rich conversation, and look to have you back soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, we are behind, but we'll play it with a catch up. Next up, we have a final presentation for a proposed budget for central services. Both of our Deputy Chief Operating Officers are here today, Andrew Scott and Holly Calhoun. Andrew and Holly, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. And actually, it's just going to be me today. Holly's doing some housing related work. So anyway, thank you. And we're going to bring the team up here. And I think there's probably room for everybody. We talked about cycling through, but given the way it's set up, I think there's probably room for everybody. So we can move on to the next slide. And this is the agenda for today. It's again, I'm going to do a very brief introduction and then we'll turn it over to the departments. And obviously we had talked about maybe trying to go through the presentation pretty quickly and then opening up for general questions afterwards. Obviously, if you have a specific question about a specific department, we can do that as well. But let's go ahead and move to the next slide. I wanted to, before we dive in to the specific departments, and you're going to hear each of them talk about performance measures and strategic targets, but I wanted to just provide a little bit of an overview. You've been hearing from departments about how they're aligning their programs and services with the strategic targets that council has adopted around economy and housing, and specifically about how performance measures are being developed to track and measure those progress towards those commitments. Central services, including finance, HR, IT, communications, capital asset management, the folks you're going to hear from today, provide the underlying support and logistics that really help power our organization and support those external efforts around those strategic targets. They help us hire and train employees, provide core technical business systems and equipment, manage the agency's finances, communicate and engage with stakeholders, manage our capital assets, and address systemic inequities that impact our communities and more. So as part of the strategic targets process, we're developing a bucket of what we're calling support and logistics measures. The budget performance measures for these departments are going to help us assess the overall health of the organization, identify opportunities for enterprise-wide process improvements, and make some more informed operational decisions. For today, central service departments are going to be talking about a mix of existing performance measures. So some of these performance measures you'll hear about today are going to tie directly to that strategic target work, for instance, such as energy usage in our buildings. Other measures that you're going to hear about today are important to the ongoing operations, but maybe not directly tied into those strategic targets. So I just wanted to give that overall overview. We continue to work on building this overall performance measurement system around strategic targets. And again, this is an important component to it, but one that's a little bit more indirect. With that, I'm going to turn it over to our individual directors to walk through proposed budgets. I do want to note that some members of our team are hearing impaired, and so when we get to the Q&A, it'd be great if we could all just make sure we're speaking really clearly into the microphones. It just makes it easier for all of us to hear. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Brian, who's going to talk about FRS.
Thank you. Next slide. One more. Again, I'm Brian Kennedy, Chief Financial Officer, use he, him pronouns. I'm here to talk about the Finance and Regulatory Services Department. So in the current year, the major new investments we made were around additional COVID training and outreach. That is implemented and going well. We also added 2 new FTE supporting the support of housing services taxes, both on the compliance and tax analysis side. And then we added 1 FTE that is an investment in our technology systems and processes. That's a new business analyst position. Next slide, please. For next year's budget, our total budget request is just over $20 million. I want to note that that does include the risk fund, where we pay the agency's insurance premiums, property liability, as well as carry a reserve for losses. So of that 20 million, around 5.5 million-ish is related to the risk fund. 80 FTE overall supporting our key finance functions, budget, finance and accounting, payroll, procurement, risk, and our new tax and revenue capacity. We're also making new investment in agency-wide forecasting and analytics that I'll talk about more in just a second. Next slide, please. Our performance measures, our key measure is around the dollars and percentage of contracts using COVID certified firms. This represents a portion of our work, but we think it's one of the most important because it reflects actual dollars moving out to firms that are minority owned, women owned, emerging small businesses, and businesses owned by service disabled veterans. We're also looking at a target related to the percentage of our major funds in compliance with the reserve targets, pretty relevant to the conversation you just had around the visitor venues. Next slide, please. Our key equity metric is, again, those contract awards to COVID firms. We produce a report every year on our equity and contracting program that should be going to you shortly. We do it for the calendar year, and I have data on our calendar year awards year over year here. You can see 2023 is down over 2022. Part of that reflects the just varying levels of activity in contract awards that Metro does on a given year. But again, we think this is a really key metric. This is one when I started at Metro, we were not doing nearly as well at, but with focus from council and leadership, we've made really significant progress in improving utilization of COVID firms over time. Next slide, please. In terms of the new target areas, we support all of the agency, obviously, but our key investment is going to be around our new revenue and analytics division, and we're going to be supporting the entire agency in the strategic targets work. Let's go to the next slide. So our budget modifications, we have 1 FTE for our contract management. You've heard related to a couple of audits over the last year about a need to improve contract management and contract compliance. So we're making a new investment there. We're also adding an FTE to support the strategic targets work as directed by council. And then one of the things I'm most excited about is 3 new FTE as part of our revenue and analytics division to really provide agency-wide capacity for economic and financial forecasting, performance measurement that is kind of rooted in the budget process. I think one of the challenges we've had is aligning our performance measurement work with the budget process, and having those co-located in finance creates a really interesting and unique opportunity to make sure that work is strongly connected. So this is a significant investment that I think brings a lot of capacity to the agency, and we're already seeing it internally in terms of some of our work around housing, the urban growth report process, and solid waste forecasting. And then finally, we have an increase in our risk fund materials and services, again, related to increases in premiums. Just like you're seeing everywhere else in the world, those costs are going up, and they're going up for Metro as well. With that, I am done.
All right. Well, good afternoon, Council. My name is Ryan Kinsella. I use he, him pronouns. I'm the Director of Capital Asset Management for Oregon Metro. Just as a reminder, Capital Asset Management, we have 5 sections. We have our Construction Project Management Office. Our Campus Operations team runs the Metro Regional Center. We have the Sustainability team, Asset Management team, and Emergent Management team, part of our department. Made a number of strides in areas last year, but here's a few highlights that are aligned with our with Council's investment areas. First, we helped deliver on a $244 million capital improvement plan that consisted of over 180 projects. Those 180 projects were each evaluated on how the Sustainable Building and Sites policy applied to it, which resulted in 500 policy requirements, which is really exciting. It really demonstrates how we actually translate those climate and environment goals into our building. We also completed a facility condition assessment for the Metro Regional Center. That unto itself would have been a big win for us, but we also use that as an opportunity to reestablish our standards around asset management. So reviewing our criticality and condition level data standards that we use for building out for the building. And we're going to apply that to across all Metro facilities moving forward. And then lastly, we've been working closely with Katie McDonald, who we heard from earlier today, Metro's tribal liaison, to help create and establish the Historic Preservation Officer program, working with tribes to hear their priorities in the development of that program, and also what that recruitment looks like. Let's go on to the next slide. For our performance measures, we are primarily focused around the environmental target. And for phase 1, we looked at targets that we thought were both impactful, that we could measure and that were within our control. The first one there is our building energy use. We're currently tracking that as part of our sustainability plan for the agency. So we're going to be looking at % reduction in energy use of our facilities compared to a baseline. We are also looking at our conversion over to EV vehicles. Currently, 10% of Metro's fleet is electric vehicles, and we're making pretty significant investments in those areas that I'm going to highlight here in a slide. For our looking further down the road, we want to look at metrics that are going to be even more impactful, more ambitious, and align with our sustainability, broader sustainability plans. So we're going to be measuring total greenhouse gas emissions for our internal operations, looking at the % of electricity that's renewable at our facilities. And then one of the big white whales of our sustainability work is that food waste reduction that Craig talked about a little bit earlier, but something that we're going to be really invested in. Let's go on to the next slide. For our key equity metrics, we are tracking the workforce diversity of our construction contracts. And this year, this last calendar year, we had 37% of our hours on construction contracts that were performed by people of color. That's up from 34% from the previous year. And I attribute that sustainment and success a lot to the broader work that's being done by DEI around the Regional Collaborative Collective to supporting the diversity in trades. But it also, I think, speaks to the commitment of our DEI staff and our project managers in helping to implement that program. Just as a short example of like what that looks like in practice, we recently had Brent Shelby, our project manager for the Parks and Nature program, recently just met with the Columbia Pacific Building and Construction Trades Council on site at Blue Lake Park to talk through what those projects were looking like. We had some of the union representatives come on site and also the CMGC for that project. And we talked about what those workforce equity goals were and what the challenges and some of the opportunities there were for implementation of that. So that's just like a short of example of what that actually looks like in practice and that commitment. Let's go on to our next slide here. So we made a handful of investments in council's target areas. A couple I just wanted to briefly highlight is first that Sustainable Building Sites policy. When we passed that a year ago, we did allocate staff, both internal staff, within our department and working with like other departments to ensure the success of that program. So we have currently 1 FTE total across a couple different positions that are ensuring the successful implementation of that program. And again, that makes sure that we're building with 100% renewable electricity, that we're phasing out fossil fuels, and that we're trying to reduce embodied carbon into our building materials. We've also made some pretty significant investments in our electric vehicles. As I mentioned earlier, we've done almost an investment of $1 million in electric vehicle conversion and charging infrastructure over the past 2 fiscal years. And we have almost $1 million budgeted for infrastructure and charging and vehicle replacement in the next fiscal year. All right, let's go on to the next one here. This slide is just a shorter overview of CAM's budget. We have almost an $8 million budget, 36 FTE. It almost exclusively supports our personnel services. We have got a little bit for materials and services, but that's primarily for our operations and maintenance of the Metro Regional Center. And I think onto my last slide. We have 2 budget modifications that are included in the proposed budget. The first is the conversion of our gendered restrooms on the 2nd floor of the Metro Regional Center, converting those over to single-user restrooms. We know that the conversion of these facilities is an important step as we implement our trans and non-binary initiative. We also recently surveyed Metro Regional Center staff, and we found that 55% of our trans and non-binary staff would increase their use of the Metro Regional Center by having those single-user restrooms available on the 2nd floor. And it's also just an important way of communicating out to the public that we've made that commitment. Our last modification.
How many are there?
Well, I'm sorry, what was that?
How many restrooms are we converting?
We're going to be converting over the entire bank of the gendered restrooms. And so we have to look into what the plumbing is all going to work out to be, but effectively we'd be converting over both the men's and women's restroom on the 2nd floor to single user restrooms. I'm anticipating it's probably somewhere in the range of probably 5 to 8 single user restrooms that will be converted over. And then our last budget modification is for the carry forward of $100,000 to support the implementation of the Historic Preservation Officer program that was included in last year's budget modification. And these funds will effectively seed the funding that we need to support cultural resource management of our current existing construction projects. And with that, I think I get to hand it over to Leah.
Good afternoon. I'm Leah Wavioli. I use she, her pronouns. And I have the honor of representing Central Communications today and talking about the important work of communications practitioners across the organization. Before we dive in, I want to just take a moment to talk about our structure, since this has come up a few times in other budget presentations and caused a little confusion. For many years, Communications at Metro has included teams of folks who are dedicated to specific departments, as well as people who work across those storylines to guide and support communications channels and systems for all of Metro, the venues, and the zoo. In November of 2021, we changed our reporting structure and moved those department-specific teams into their respective departments, which are Waste Prevention, Environmental Services, Parks and Nature, Planning, Development, Research, Housing. What is changing this year is that we are also shifting the funding for those teams into those departments, which is why you saw new FTE in those presentations, even though we're not adding new positions. My presentation today is really focused on the part of communications that remains centrally funded and is here to support all the parts of Metro that don't have their own communications team, including the Metro Council, and to build tools and systems that we all use to ensure that our communications are coordinated, effective, aligned with your priorities, and truly help people understand and connect with Metro services and opportunities. Next slide. So last year, you invested in 2 really important positions in Central Communications, an associate who coordinates our media and social media teams and builds tools and systems for our practitioners across the organization in those areas, and also a new manager who leads the design and web teams, as well as our brand, marketing, and much of our translation and accessibility work. You also funded investments in media sponsorships to bolster messaging around water safety, recycling, hazardous waste, and awareness of Metro services. Big shout out to Councilors Lewis and Gonzalez, who have both been featured in television spots as part of this effort. Our new brand manager is working with communications teams in the storylines to leverage our paid media, negotiate better advertising rates for the agency holistically, and increase visibility for our services and opportunities. An early example will be our newly consolidated search engine marketing initiative. Funds for evaluation and user testing will center communities of color, people with disabilities, and others who experience barriers and be used to inform a new Metro website and ensure that our communications tools and deliverables are useful and usable. These are all ongoing investments that will continue to help us meet our equity and performance goals. Next slide. This is our proposed budget for this year. We don't have budget modifications, so I'm going to take just a little extra time to talk about our base budget and how we use it to support communications across the organization. As you can see, we have 15.2 FTE. So personnel is the bulk of our budget. That includes the inclusive design and web team that I just mentioned, as well as the strategic communications team. I'm going to talk a little bit more about what they do. Our M&S budget is about $400,000 that really goes into supporting training, coordination, and leadership for communications practitioners across the organization and ensure best practices and strategies for public engagement, marketing, media relations, audience research, design and brand, content, messaging, and social media. We also design and manage content for the Metro website and work with our partners in IT to build and maintain accessible multilingual websites for Metro, the zoo, and the venues. You're going to be hearing more about the technical part of that work and the budget that supports it in Rachel's presentation. Our part of that work is really to, in addition to managing content, really set the standards and provide training tools and systems to support accessibility and translation for all of Metro and the venues and the zoo. We also provide, with these positions and funds, direct support for the Metro Council venues, DEI, CAM, Finance, and HR, and friends here at the table. We, this year, have identified money in our base budget to help up our game across all this work, with a particular focus on removing or at least chipping away at barriers that keep people from participating in Metro services and opportunities. We are creating tools, training, and resources that ensure our communications work is as inclusive as possible and follows best practices. We continue to invest in audience research in partnership with GAPD to understand more about how the public thinks about the issues we work on and the words that make sense and resonate with them. We also have ongoing funds, as we mentioned, to help us evaluate our work and whether we're meeting our goals. Enable us to share out that information with Metro leadership and communications practitioners so that we can all discover how we can do a better job of reaching people in the ways that work best for them. We set aside money also to invest in digital ads and paid social media to promote opportunities to join our committees, help shape Metro Council decisions, and access grants and other resources. We are investing in a brand refresh and new collateral to strengthen awareness and understanding of Metro and build trust and belonging with the public we serve. We also set aside funds to provide stipends and pay for translation, captions, and other accessibility features for our content and activities. There are also pots of money for things like that in each of the department's budgets, but we wanted to have some money in the center to make sure we can always fill those gaps when they come up and to pay for some of the things that don't, like I said, have a specific department communications team. Next slide. The investments I've mentioned so far, including the added staff capacity, have made new things possible in terms of measuring our performance. These will be new practices for us, and we have some work to do, and we'll spend some time this year really refining these measures so they can be connected to meaningful goals. But I wanted to highlight that we have new tools to manage our media and social media that include a lot of monitoring services that measure coverage, reach, and sentiment, which is a fancy word for how are people talking about us, and in the media and on social media. And not just Metro, but also the issues that we work on. How are people feeling about those things? We have a lot of new tools to help understand that. We think will make excellent performance measures for us. We also are taking a new consolidated approach to paid media investments, as I mentioned earlier. And that's primarily to leverage our investments and negotiate better rates. But an added benefit is that it gives us a much more meaningful and holistic set of analytics and reporting on the reach of these activities, which also opens up opportunities for developing some performance measures and some baselines for our outreach. Next slide. This is our key equity metric, which is to co-create and evaluate communications practices to really ensure they build trust and engagement, especially among people of color, people with disabilities, and others who face systemic oppression and barriers to access. Best example of this from this year that I really wanted to highlight is the work we did with you all to develop and adopt new principles for public engagement and an updated public engagement guide. As you know, we work closely with the Public Engagement Review Committee and got input from the Committee on Racial Equity and community members to ensure our public participation practices are inclusive and meaningful for all. And additionally, these commitments really lay out a framework for measuring our progress towards these goals, which again, we'd like to do some work to refine this year. And with that, I'm handing it over to, is it Julio?
Yes,
Are
I
you
think
next?
so. Thanks, Leah. Good afternoon, counselors. My name is Julio Garcia. I'm HR Director in Pronouns. If we go to the next slide here, I dive into my regular budget presentation. I want to spend a few minutes just sharing with you a little bit of a year in review for the HR projects and activities that took place last calendar year. In late December, I took some time to reflect on all of the things that we had done in HR in that calendar year. And I wanted to take stock of everything that had been done because I knew it was a big year. And so I put together a brief presentation. Is that for me? Is that noise or is that? Sorry. Yeah, I'm not sure either. So I'll
Hard to turn her mic off.
Rachel and I can share a mic here and see if that helps. So in any case, I put together a brief presentation last year for Marisa and for my team. And so while I don't have time to go through the entire presentation with you here today, I do want to provide you with some of the Reader's Digest highlights of those activities. So to begin, again, 2023 was a noteworthy year for our compliance with the Oregon Equal Pay Act. The year started with us conducting several pay equity focus groups, getting input and feedback from nearly 100 of our supervisors here at Metro. We concluded the year by having implemented an entirely new compensation framework for our non-represented employees. This was a really big lift, and it included things like establishing new classification criteria for most of our supervisor positions. It included designing an entirely new wage scale for non-represented employees, developing a new wage placement tool that is in place today, and of course, launching a new compensation policy. On the benefits front, we implemented both Washington's and Oregon's paid leave programs. We rolled out a new benefits administration module, which helped automate our enrollment process. And we learned that our education and outreach efforts for employee retirement planning have been incredibly successful over the years. Specifically, over the last 5-year period, we saw a 72% increase in employee participation in our 457 retirement plan. Through these efforts, we're making a real difference in the lives of our employees and helping them secure a better financial future for themselves and for their families. And I think that's particularly important because our more recent recruitment efforts have included hiring more people of color. And so bringing a more diverse population on board and helping provide these wonderful tools is a great thing for our workforce. On the bargaining front, as you well know, we've completed successor bargaining on 3 contracts, 3 collective bargaining agreements, and that was a really big lift. And that doesn't even include all of the interim bargaining that we did with our various policies and letters of agreement. So it was a busy time for bargaining as well. We also saw significant strides in our training programs. We launched a very successful monthly manager lunch and learn series. It's going on every month and being very well attended and getting great reviews. And we measured a 215% increase in the training activities from the prior year, having delivered nearly, or rather just over 9,500 hours of training for our employees. On the talent acquisition front, we saw a 15% increase in the number of recruitments from the prior year. So it's been a very busy year for us. Next slide, please. To wrap up the year in review, here are just a handful of the metrics that I thought you might be interested in. In 2023, we managed 200, looks like one more slide. There we go. Thank you. We managed 231 employee relations cases. We conducted 52 investigations, completed 535 recruitments, processed 169 leave cases, and again, delivered just shy of 10,000 hours of training. That was a very quick and abbreviated version of what I put together for my team, and just a snapshot of what we achieved in just 1 year. I know that my team and our executive leadership team really appreciated that overview. I hope it was useful to council as well. And I just want to take a second to acknowledge not only the incredible people I get to work with in my department every day who work tirelessly on all of this important work that we do, but many of the people here around this table and their teams. None of the work that we do in isolation. We do it in collaboration with IT and finance and employee comms and everyone else throughout the organization. So that year in review was a reflection of a lot of collaboration. With that, now I'll pivot to the next slide and onto the regular part of the budget presentation. This slide shows HR's 2 budget modifications from last year. The first was for an additional $30,000 to complete the 2023 pay equity analysis project for non-represented employees that I mentioned just a bit ago. And the second modification was actually back in March of 2023 when we came to you with a budget amendment asking to convert a limited duration position to a regular status position. Next slide, please. HR's proposed total budget for fiscal year 25 is $7.2 million. As with most departments that you've heard from today, the lion's share of this, of course, goes to our personnel costs. If approved by council, HR's budget would increase to just over $6.5 million for 34 FTEs. That would be up from 32 this year. That leaves just shy of about $680,000 for our M&S budget. You've heard me say before that the lion's share of that, about 75% of our M&S budget, is earmarked for agency-wide programs and services that support all employees. Things such as our retirement plan administrator, our investment consultant, our benefits broker, our employee assistance program, and many other similar type services. So the bulk of what remains in our M&S budget supports operational needs within HR, such as software licensing and computer equipment. Next slide, please. As far as our budget performance measures go, here are some of our contributions. For one, our required learning program offers all mandatory training courses online, mitigating the need for employees to have to drive to a physical location to complete the training. And this, of course, aligns with our climate justice goals. Another example is with our housing department. We continue to make their reclassification and recruitment needs among our top priorities so that they have the resources they need to advance the critical work that they are doing in our region. And of course, we help contribute to our local economy through efforts like our recently established minimum wage of $20.20 per hour and our generous benefit programs. Next slide, please. Now onto our equity metric. As I've noted before in previous meetings with council, research shows that access to learning and development opportunities is one of the key drivers to employee engagement. It's a very important investment that yields great return for an organization. This fiscal year to date, employees have taken 255 different courses, 63 of which were DEI related subjects. This has resulted in over 11,000 hours of training for our workforce, again, in this fiscal year to date. As far as the equity impact goes, we are tracking this information by ethnicity, gender, and job type, and we do continue to make progress on improving access to training for our variable hour employees. One thing I did want to note to Councillor Nolan's question earlier about, to Craig, about how we're tracking the completion of our DEI training. We now have 2 really neat dashboards. One of them is a dashboard that we've made available to every supervisor in the organization, where they can go in at any point and have real-time data that will show them which courses have been completed and which courses have not been completed for their employees, the courses that are part of this retirement or required learning program. So it's a really great tool that gives us that real-time data and information that we did not have before. Similarly, we've developed another dashboard which goes to each employee where they can then go in and track their own compliance with the required learning program. Let's see, I think that takes me to the next slide, our budget modifications. On this slide, I've broken out HR's budget modifications for this coming fiscal year 25 into two sections. The first section is regarding our FTE requests. We're asking for a fully dedicated analyst to support the short and long-term needs for the ERP system project, which I believe you've heard about from Andrew. The second FTE we're asking for comes from a request made by our leadership team at the zoo. The zoo is our largest department at Metro with 23% of our workforce. After a review of the HR services provided to departments across the organization, we concluded that a new FTE is needed to support the growing and complex needs of the zoo, again, our largest department. The second section on this slide lists the two requests we're making for our materials and services budget. We're asking for $22,500 to invest in our current applicant tracking system. This will allow us to implement a new onboarding module, and it will basically provide for the automation of a number of things that historically we've had to do manually. As I mentioned earlier, we've invested in a new learning management system a few years back, a couple of years ago, and I'm happy to report that the utilization of this system has been nothing short of fantastic. And so my second request here is to further invest in that system. And so we're asking for a $27,000 supplement to help expand the number of online courses that we have access to. This investment would take us from the 100 courses that we currently have a limit with, and it would basically have no limit. We would have access to the thousands and thousands of courses that are available through the vendor that we're working with. And this really came as a result of a demand that we saw from our partners in DEI, our partners in our safety program. They were all coming to us asking for us to add classes to this online course catalog that we have available to us. And so this solution will really help us expand that service organization-wide. And I think that's my final slide. I'll hand it off to Rachel.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Rachel Tull. I'm Metro's Chief Information Officer. It's good to see you this afternoon. Thank you for your patience. I know it was a long day. Okay, next slide, please. So I'm going to talk about the 23-24 investment progress. We had 3 staff members added for this current year. One was a IT project management office manager. And so that was to help add capacity for doing IT projects. They're notoriously difficult to do sometimes and can have a high failure rate. And we've been extremely busy, as you can understand. We're putting in new software at the transfer station. We're looking at zoo software. We have remote software everywhere. So we've been really busy. So we're trying to add capacity to that area and be able to manage projects well. We have a good implementation rate, but you can always do better. A systems analyst for business systems, that will be mostly dedicated to the transfer stations for the solid waste software that's going in, and then a help desk supervisor to handle all the calls that come in for remote services and from all the staff. We also had Microsoft Security and User Management licensing. That's really a suite of security and management tools, and we're offering now a portal. When we moved to Office 365, it took away some abilities to do things like password changes, particularly for people with Macintosh computers. So we're offering a portal for that. That's going in the next week or two. We're able to add more single sign-on applications. We have 17 currently, and we'll be at 20 in the next few weeks. And then group administration, that's ease of onboarding and offboarding folks. And that helps us a lot with the additional VHEs that we've been adding. And then offsite data center, and that's really to move our current core systems offsite into a professionally managed data center. Next slide. So it's in the base budget. There's currently we actually have 38 FTE. There are 3 in the ad package that we had. So we have 38 currently. We have our help desk, which is really the face of our organization. Almost everybody knows all the help desk staff. They're everywhere and help everyone. The network folks who manage all of the core systems, all the internet, the VoIP systems, our phones, video systems, all of that, and the core network pieces, that's all in the network area. Applications, that's all the departmental applications, as well as the ones that are universals for the venues and the ERP systems. Then there's one is missing. It's the security area. We have a couple of folks who are dedicated to cybersecurity, and so they manage policies and procedures for security and incident response. We have our project management office, and then the records management, which is for public records and record retention schedules, and they process public record requests. Next slide, please.
Before you advance, Mr. Chair, may I ask a clarifying question? Your slide shows that this is general fund resources.
Yes.
Does the funding that you collect from other operations like the zoo and the venues go into the general fund and then, okay, thanks.
Next slide, thank you. So performance measures, these are a couple of the proposed performance measures that we want to do. I don't have numbers for you today, but we're in development of those, so I should have them shortly. The first is really average number of days to complete public record requests. Oregon has pretty stringent public record request requirements. We meet those, we're in compliance of those, but I want to make sure that we actually can have more information available to the public and that we're doing it within the shortest time possible. And some of that I think is just in collection of records and where they go to make sure that we can provide them easily. And then the second is just an average help desk rating measure. We provide services across the agency, and that's a really good measure to see how we're impacting those staff members and helping them to do their job. So both of these are really in support of the agency itself. Next slide. And then a key equity metric, and I have some great news here. So this is number of staff with network accounts, and this was really around racial equity. So we've been pushing out accounts to the variable hour employees. They're the folks who didn't have accounts. And so we've made really good progress on this. As you can see, we're almost 50-50 with VHE who have accounts and don't. Last year, we had 313 VHEs without accounts and 123 with. And it seems like we've got about 50 more, and those numbers are as of Monday. And we currently have a project to go out to each of the locations to talk with the managers and supervisors so that they understand what the requirements are to get in and how to access those requirements, but then also to make sure that they have the capacity, they have places where people can log into those accounts and that they're giving them the time to do so. So I think those are really important parts. Next slide. So investments in target areas. So for economy, this is really about strategic initiatives and process improvement. And I really want to give the venues, particularly OCC, a good call out in here. They've been doing a lot of process improvement within their own system. So they're leveraging their event management system to a much higher capacity. At one time, they had 17 individual projects to improve the performance in their event management system. And that's really to add additional services, and it helps with their growth and with their bottom line. In housing, really, I see a lot of that is really accessibility into the website and being able to have more, I'll talk about that in a bit, but improving our websites for folks and so that they have access to information about our programs in housing. And then environment, we are moving again that offsite data center, and that really helps with climate. Professionally managed data centers are much more efficient than ours would be. So we can turn off those systems and move them into a facility that's really purpose-built for that. Next slide. budget modification. So we're asking for 3 FTE. There's 2 FTE in network management. We have a growing technical debt in the agency where we are not able to go out and replace all equipment that we need to. We have a lot of facilities, as you can appreciate. And so getting out to those to make sure that all the interruptible power supplies and switches are all up to date has been a challenge for us. So we need to add some capacity to do that. We have another FTE that's really for night and weekend support, mainly for the venues and the transfer stations to make sure that we have systems that are working out there, but also a lot of maintenance has to occur at night. And so it's really convenient to have someone on site who can really go through those facilities and make sure that equipment is working properly and to replace things out. And then I have one FTE for a deputy director. Really, this is really to improve internal and external outreach, policy development and updates. We have some very aging policies that need to be updated, particularly in security, equity planning, strategic planning, and business continuity for our systems. And then we have a firewall and endpoint security. Our costs have increased drastically. We used to have uplift on some of our support and maintenance systems of 3 to 4%. They're 12% plus. And in one area, we have a system that is going to increase 400%. So we have really escalating costs, as do everybody. And then the endpoint security, the endpoint security is a piece that will cover laptops, tablets, other devices that are, and servers that are on the edge of our network so that we can protect them better. They have more capacity to really analyze what's going on with those systems and stop malware attacks. And that's just sort of an area that we know we need to bolster up a little bit. It helps with remote work as well. So, and then the next phase of our website development. So I want to take just a moment here to talk about the website because I think it's really important that we talk about this particular ad. So our websites are in a very aging area. They are on the edge of support. They're at end of life for the platform that we're on. We want to consolidate those and put them all on modern platforms. But in doing so, we also have an opportunity to really increase the accessibility of our websites. So the accessibility features that come into play are more things like keyboard navigation, focus, color contrast, enhances screen reader capability. There's more of our attachments will meet compliance needs, and then documents can be read by technology, video, and subtitles and descriptions on video. So there's a lot of infrastructure that we can add in for those pieces. We work in concert with communications. So communications works more on the content end, and we're really working on the back end, but we're providing the facilities that they need to improve those websites. So that translation capability and all the other accessibility compatibility cannot be improved until we improve the base. So all of that is really in IT's budget, and we work together as a team to realize those pieces. So all the work that Lee is doing and her team are doing is sort of coordinated with that. And I think that's it.
Okay, great. Thank you for our presentations. I know we're over time, but I think we'll power through the best we can and maybe hold communications for Thursday. But colleagues, any questions? Sure. Central Services. Second. Councilor Rosenthal.
Yeah, I was just trying to find my raise hand thing. Well, first of all,
Already called on you.
yeah, I know. That's why it took me so long. I was trying to find the raise hand button.
No problem. Go ahead.
I have a couple comments and then, I mean, one of a couple complaints and a couple comments. First of all, presenting 5 separate identified budgets is asking for trouble because we can ask questions about each one of those. And so it's going to take a lot of time. And I wish, but a compliment is that the information presented here was very good and really quite thorough and covered a lot of the high points. I wish a lot of this information had been included in this budget document, which was mostly bureaucratese. For example, I'll give you one example. When 15 staff are transferred, the budget document should have a footnote as to why you're transferring 50% of the staff, and it's not in there. And for example, a lot of the statistics you mentioned on terms of human resources are not really, but they talk in generalities without the specific kinds of things that you mentioned. So I think there's a lot of, there's great information today. Like I said, I wish the document hadn't wasted so much time on bureaucratic generalities. But my questions are these. First of all, on capital, it seems like there was a budget item in there specifically for food at the venues, but isn't that repetitive or redundant for what the venues themselves are doing? I mean, there was a budget allocation for assessing food recycling, I believe, for the venues. That was one. The finance and the finance department was, I noted, had increased 80% in the last 3 years. Is that a trend that's going to continue 15% per year, which is higher than a lot of other departments? Another question was human resources. I'd like to know a little bit more about what kind of courses you're talking about. You said 100 courses or courses in technical skills, job training and so forth. A little more detail there would be nice. And then on communications, each division has its own dashboard. So is communications going to be coordinating the formats of that? How does that is going to work? In other words, is each department, Parks, going to have its own dashboard, set up its own protocols and its own, make sure or are we going to have some consistency in how these dashboards are run or how you access them and so forth? And I'm just not aware that's happening at this point in time, since we're transferring a lot of people to the individual departments. So, and then last question, I suppose, was coordination between IT. And the one question I noticed on IT is, I'm just wondering if there is any thought for proactively looking at the potential implications of artificial intelligence, because it wasn't covered in any of the details. And how does that fit in? Where does that show up? So, sorry, a lot of questions, but.
Well, let's dive into those. I think we can answer most of them pretty quickly. I wanted to make sure I understood. You were talking about dashboards. Were there particular dashboards for departments? You mentioned sort of comms role in dashboards, and I wasn't sure which dashboards you were referring to.
Not each department will has some of its own dashboards. Parks has a dashboard for looking at park facilities or park services, and Human Resources has a dashboard, and Waste Management has a dashboard for looking at solid waste functions. And I'm just wondering if that's coordinated from comms, or now is that left to the individual departments?
Okay. I think the answer, Leah can help with it. I think the answer, is that the communications teams for each of those departments help with those. And of course, the communications teams talk to one another. So there's some sharing of information across there, but it really depends. We are centrally coordinating dashboards around performance measurement, but individual departments would do their own dashboards for things that are very specific to that department. But let's go back through your questions overall. I know there was a sort of food waste question, Ryan, around that metric and your coordination with OCC on that.
So there's no budget request specifically related to the tracking of the food waste, and we do work directly with the OCC on tracking the food waste. They're currently in a multi-state pilot with the Pacific Coast Collaborative Food Waste Commitment, which is trying to reduce overall food waste by 50% by 2030. And so our sustainability team works with the OCC folks in compliance with that broader initiative. And then we're also working directly with Levy. As part of their contract, they do have sustainability goals, and part of that is food waste reduction. So we've been working with them to make sure that they're in compliance with their overall food waste reduction.
So it's not repetitive of what the individual venues are doing?
No, we're working directly with them on
Levy.
that. Yeah, oftentimes our team is consulting and facilitating directly with venues to make sure that they're making progress on those goals.
Okay.
Yeah.
On the question about finance and the growth in the budget, what you're seeing is the kind of result of essentially an accounting budgetary change we made a couple of years ago, where our departmental finance teams, so like communications, we have teams that support the zoo, WPES, parks, planning, housing, and prior to fiscal 22, I believe, those were directly charged in those department budgets. And in 22 or 21, we brought those into the overall finance budget. And so the significant increase is a result of that change. We have had some additions since then, so I would not expect that, long-term trend to continue because there aren't additional finance staff out there to centralize and consolidate in our department.
Yeah, most of that change was, there was like almost a 40% increase in 1 year, and that would be when that was distributed, or I should say coordinated, concentrated in the finance department.
Yes.
Okay.
And I'll tackle the one question that you had about the courses. So with the way this is set up in our learning management system, we have some courses that we develop internally. So they're customized training on things like our specific policies, like our anti-bullying policy or our harassment prevention policy or our gender inclusion policy. We have trainings on all of those courses that we've developed internally and deliver them through the learning management system. In addition to that, we have a whole suite of online courses that are available to us through this third-party vendor called Open Sesame, and that's what we're trying to invest in. And that has a whole bunch of off-the-shelf courses, things that do revolve around, for example, some of the technical courses that you talked about, like it could be Excel, training on Excel or any kind of Microsoft product training. We also have very specific trainings that are provided through that platform. Some of our positions, very few, but some positions require for their job something called bloodborne pathogen training. These are canned products that we can just deliver through the system. In addition to that, what prompted the ask for additional funding is that we had our partners from our DEI department and from our safety team coming to us asking for an additional suite of options to be included for those areas. And so it's a real mix, and I'm happy to get you a copy of the thousands of courses that are available if you'd like, but that gives you just kind of a general flavor.
Yeah, I was just wondering if, for example, it would include courses that would train people how to restore wetlands, for example.
How do we restore?
Which is something Parks and Nature can use. In other words, techniques for replanting vegetation in restored wetlands or something like that. There's a lot of technical courses, things we do, solid waste, how to handle hazardous materials, for example, at our hazardous material facilities, things like that. I was just wondering how broad the kinds of courses were that would be covered, not just, how to use Excel.
Right. No, and it is very broad.
Okay.
Rachel, you want to talk about how we've solved AI?
Easy one.
It's easy.
So we are currently looking at how to deal with AI. There's two sort of components to this to me. There is the data quality and data governance. So we're working on a data governance policy, and we're just launching now an AI policy review. And to me, you really have to have those policies in place and those guardrails before you can just sort of let that out. We've had some requests to use AI, but if you can't explain it, interpret it, or audit that data, it's useless. And in order to create trust in government and keep that, we really need to have those policies in place before we can move forward. So we are launching that, and it'll be a widespread interviewing folks, seeing what they want to use AI for, making sure that we are looking at, other governments and what they're doing with AI, and making sure that we look at really how we want to use it and what the guardrails are going to be for that.
And I guess my question was, it would seem that this is something fairly new that we're doing, and it didn't include any budget additions or FTEs additions. It's all handled within, and to what extent is the skills necessary to do this something that we may have to add to our skill set?
I think that's
because I don't understand.
I think it's
AI.
entirely possible that we will have to do that. I think after we
Okay.
have the assessments and the policy in place, we can really take a concerted review of what we need to look at. I don't know that everybody knows what we want to do with it. It's sort of this wild thing that you can use it for. So, on an individual basis, using it on your desktop, or are we using it to incorporate it in our data analysis that we're doing? That's very possible. There are pieces in GIS that can use AI. So we really need to review how we want to use it, and then we may have to have some additional ads to really, to see it.
Good, thank you. Councilor Lewis.
Sure, thank you so much. I want to thank all of you for coming, and obviously we could spend all day going through a bulk of information. But overall, central services, y'all are doing right by the public and by us as an agency. Obviously, we've heard from some budgets that one of their cost drivers is central service costs. Everything you've talked about today is more than defensible. So I'm proud of the investments we're making. And I will take everything else I have to say offline in respect for the clock.
Thank you. I do have a question for Julio. And I saw in your slide you had 231 employee relations and 52 investigations. And I'm wondering, without getting into specifics, if there's a common thread or a trend. And I guess I'm just questioning, my question is really like, are there specific areas that we need to be investing deeper resources into to address any sort of cultural issues that might exist or microcultures in departments?
Sure. Well, first of all, I will say that I think those numbers are actually a really good thing. I think it is proof that our Safe Workplace campaign that we launched a couple of years ago has indeed been very successful. It's created this awareness and this knowledge, and I think really we've shown that people are now more comfortable and more aware of how to go about filing complaints, and so that's good. So I wouldn't be too alarmed by the numbers. That was really more on wanting to show the volume of work that this small department is doing. So I think the numbers, it's good to track them and be aware of them. To your other point about, are there any trends that we're seeing? We have committed to coming to council and to labor once a year, providing you with that overall trend. We provided that a couple of months ago. And without going into detail, what I will say is we've got our eye on this. We have a really great case management tracking tool that allows us to do a deeper assessment in a way that we were not able to do before. One thing I will say that I think is in part responsible for the uptick in those employee relations cases is we did see an increase in accommodation requests. And that was across the board and for very specific reasons that we won't go into here. But yeah, it's really fascinating data to track.
Okay, great. We'll look forward to further conversation on that.
And can I just, in summary, so thank you for your time today. It is a lot of information, and actually with the venues and central services, you've heard from 8 departments today. So it's a long day, but we're trying to go through. And I would also say, we have intentionally, given council direction in the past, tried to balance your time, given much more time to some of our really large external departments, really consolidating these presentations briefly. We are more than happy to come and talk to any of you at length. I know all these directors would be happy to dive into any questions you have in individual briefings, or if council wanted to schedule additional work sessions. So we're more than willing to do that. And any follow-up questions you didn't have today, feel free to send them our way and we'll get back to you. So thanks for your time.
Okay, great. Thank you, Andrew. And thank you all for your work. Okay, Andrew, did you have any quick communications?
I have nothing today, no.
We hold them for Thursday. Okay, great. Well, seeing no further discussion, I want to thank everyone for spending an extra half hour with us, and the council work session is adjourned. Our next regular meeting is set for Thursday, May 2nd, 2024 at 10:30 a.m.